Soldier's Heart by Alex 51324. Chapter 34. April to May, 1919. Ask me another one, Thomas said. They were in a Leon's tea shop, where Liesl, Peter's governess friend, was supposed to be meeting them. She was late, and Thomas was not inclined to waste the time. Peter referred to the sheet of sample exam questions. Identify the 3 types of fuel feed systems and describe the advantages and disadvantages of each. That was an easy one. The 3 types are gravity, pressure, and vacuum. No one used gravity anymore, so we'd get that one out of the way first. The disadvantages are in design that the fuel tank has to be located somewhere above the engine, and in safety that if the engine catches fire, you can't stop gravity to keep the fuel from going into the fire. Advantages... It's so simple, not much can go wrong with it, I guess. As for pressure systems... He was still giving his answer when Liesl turned up. He stood, but didn't stop. She was a governess. She ought to understand about preparing for examinations. And she did, apparently. She waited for him to come to the end of his answer before saying, "It's good to see both of you looking so well." Peter did look well. He was starting to regain the weight he'd lost while he was in Germany, and they'd been in London long enough now not to look for ghosts on every street corner. Neither of them had so much as mentioned the criterion, but Peter had, of course, made plenty of friends from his program at Queen Mary's, and it suited him, having things to do and people to talk to. Thomas would have been perfectly happy never having to talk to anyone but Peter, but they were different in that way. Liesl asked about his time in Germany, and Peter talked about it in the same light, airy sort of way he always did and had in his letters. Oh, we were all right, really. Some of the prison camps were rather bad, but we were in a hospital. And that sort of thing. At one point she said, "I can't believe the Red Cross did not notify us. I feel I should apologize on behalf of my countrymen." That's right, the Red Cross headquarters was in Switzerland. "I'm sure losing you to England was a blow to their famous efficiency," Peter said gallantly. More practically, Thomas added, "It could well have been the Germans' doing. I don't suppose we'll ever know quite how it happened." Peter also talked enthusiastically about what he was doing at Queen Mary's. They had him in something they called a one-handers class, which was, as the name implied, for men who'd lost a hand or arm. "It's really a very good idea working with us all together," he explained. "Nearly everyone has been managing without his hand for a while now, so we've all worked out our ways of doing things, and this way we can learn from each other. One chap even came up with a way to tie his shoes." If Thomas had had to relearn as a grown man how to tie his shoes, he was certain he would rather have had hot irons held to his eyelids than discuss it, but Peter didn't seem to mind. And the shoe-tying method really was fairly clever. It involved putting a knot in one end of the shoelace, like a piece of sewing thread, and pulling it through the first hole as far as the knot, so that you were working with only one free end of lace instead of 2. There was a bit of a trick to stringing the single lace through the rest of the holes, and at the end of it you knotted it around itself and tucked the free end away. Some of the blokes, Peter said, could only manage the last step after someone else had laced up their shoes for them, but of course Peter could do both parts. "And your chauffeuring course?" Liesl asked, once they had exhausted the subject of what Peter had been learning. "Peter writes that it's very complicated." "It's not so bad," Thomas said. "We do a couple of hours in the classroom every morning, so that's a bit of a change." Our AMC training had involved some classroom instruction, but not much. It felt strange to be sitting at a desk taking notes again after all these years out of school. But at least the instructors didn't smack your hands with the pointer when you blotted your copybook. But then in the afternoons we're either in the workshop or out on the road. The course put a bit more emphasis on the actual driving bit than Branson's books had, mostly learning the traffic laws and practicing driving under various conditions. During a convenient cold snap, for instance, they'd flooded the driving track with water, which was then allowed to freeze, and you had to practice steering out of skids. Thomas somehow ended up on the subject of magnetos. Thomas still felt that his grasp of them was a bit shaky, and Liesl was able to fill in a few gaps in his understanding of magnetism, using a bit of salt from the table salt shaker to sketch out magnetic fields. "I admit," she said, sweeping up the salt and depositing it in her saucer, "I did not realize how much science was involved in motor cars. I wonder if Lady H's chauffeur would be willing to help with the girls' lessons." Laura, the elder of my pupils, has become more interested in frocks and fellows than lessons, but she is keen to learn to drive. Perhaps introducing a practical aspect would persuade her to take a lesson seriously. Might need to be careful about that, Thomas said, thinking of recent events at Downton. Depending on what the chauffeur looks like. Lizel looked a bit puzzled at that, and Peter explained, Lord G's daughter has fallen in love with their current chauffeur. To Thomas he added, but if they have the same chauffeur in the country as before, he's about 50, probably not a lot of risk there. He is, Lizel confirmed, old enough not to be called up, thankfully. Speaking of old blokes, Lizel asked after Anna. They had exchanged a few letters during the time Thomas had been away, apparently, and Peter brought her up to date on the melodrama of Bates and the late Miss Bates, concluding, they're free to marry now legally, but I suppose they feel it would be better to wait until all the questions over her death are settled. Thomas privately thought that could be a long wait. Would the police ever pronounce themselves satisfied that Bates hadn't killed his wife, or would they simply move on to other things? But he'd been keeping that thought to himself for a while now, since Peter had told him Anna was unlikely to find it helpful. Will they leave service, then? Lizel asked. Peter frowned a bit. I got the impression they were planning on staying at least for a while. His lordship told them they could have a cottage. Thomas chipped in. Ages ago, when they first started talking about getting married. How lovely, Lizel said. You'll be neighbours. Thomas hadn't thought of it quite that way before. Oh, we'll have to have them over to dinner, Peter said. They wouldn't have to, but, well, it was a thought. And have you heard anything from Thomas? Miss Hughes asked one afternoon at tea. At the head of the table, Mr. Carson harumphed. I've just had a letter from Mr. Fitzroy, as a matter of fact, she said. He says that the course is going well, but now it's almost time for the exams. Thomas is getting a bit frantic. Daisy paused in going around with the teapot to ask, what kind of examination do they give in a chauffeuring course? He says there's a written examination, a driving test, and a practical examination in the workshop. Anna explained. The written part is mostly about how engines work and a bit about traffic laws and how to drive safely. He's a bit worried about the practical because they can't ask them to demonstrate almost anything, and they could choose something that's difficult with his shoulder.
And what is he planning to do about those things if he does become a chauffeur?
Mr. Carson asked. He'll have Mr. Fitzroy to lend him a hand, Anna said. As long as he only needs the one, Miss O'Brien pointed out tartly. Anna thought that even Mr. Carson, who made no secret that he would prefer it if Mr. Fitzroy were anywhere but at Downton, looked a little disgusted at that. Miss O'Brien, Miss Hughes said sharply. Mr. Carson attempted a change of subject.
Do we know anything about Mr. Branson's plans? I'm happy to see him go.
Anna concentrated intently on her tea cake. Lady Sybil had not offered any confidences on the subject, a fact for which Anna was grateful, as it would have put her in a very awkward position to have definite knowledge of a plan of which his lordship and her ladyship would certainly disapprove. But she couldn't help but pick up some hints of what was afoot. For one thing, Lady Sybil always seemed to know precisely how much longer it was until Thomas was expected back from his course, as if she were counting down the days. For another, she had stopped asking Anna carefully casual questions about such subjects as whether two people from different worlds could really understand each other, and how various household routines were conducted in what she called a more ordinary house. If interrogated on the subject, and Anna knew she had Thomas's influence to thank that she was even thinking of it in that way, she could claim she'd had some idea about Lady Sybil's feelings for Branson, but had believed she'd made the sensible decision to part ways. It might even be true. The wardmaster greeted Thomas with enthusiastic shoulder thumping, which rapidly turned into something that an outside observer unfamiliar with the wardmaster just might have termed a hug.
Now what you a sight for so fucking eyes?
I'm glad to see you too, Sergeant, Thomas said. The wardmaster chuckled.
Buzzfucker,
he said fondly. Giving Thomas a final pat, he ambled over to the bar for a brief consultation with the barman, returning with a bottle of something and a couple of glasses.
So,
He said, settling his bulk into one of the pub's rickety chairs and pouring.
a fucking chauffeur. Don't mind me, son, but it seems like kind of a fucking waste.
I thought so too, really, but motor cars are actually a lot more interesting than I thought, Thomas said, and launched into the by now familiar explanation of how chauffeuring was a lot more complicated than just driving, concluding, besides that, with so many normal people driving their own cars these days, there could be a bit of extra money in doing repairs on the side. Enough, perhaps, to save something up. Perhaps it was an auto repair shop that they'd have one day if they wanted. It could even have a small sideline and clacks.
All right, if you say so,
The wardmaster said, topping up the glasses.
But you're not gonna have any lads to look after now I've taught you all I know.
Thomas felt oddly warm inside, but that might have been the whiskey. I'll have one, he said, and that might be nice for a while at least, really, having only himself and Peter to look after. My brother's going to live with me. I told you about his arm, didn't I? He hadn't put in a letter that Peter wasn't his brother, of course, and he wondered now how he could say so, and whether he ought to. That's kind of the point of it. I'll have my own cottage and all.
Right,
The wardmaster said.
Fitzroy. You've different fathers, I take it.
Yes, Thomas admitted, lighting a cigarette.
Different mothers, too.
Naturally, he'd figured it out. Yeah. Admiringly, the wardmaster said.
No, that's a good fucking dodge. And of a lot better than pretending you're some Rupert's fucking valet, if you ask me.
It is, Thomas agreed.
And this Earl of what the fuck he doesn't suspect.
Now, Thomas hesitated. This was the part that really sounded insane. He knows. The wardmaster stared at him for a moment, then nodded, tipping the bottle over their glasses again.
Oh, he's...
No, Thomas said. Devoted to his wife, as a matter of fact. If it was like that, Thomas would have been valid ages ago.
Fuck me blind,
The wardmaster said, sitting back in his chair.
and he's promised you this job.
As long as I did all right on my exams, yes. Thomas had sat them earlier that day. He'd decided that since the promised post-war drink with the wardmaster was bound to turn into at least half a dozen drinks, it was best to save it for after he was finished cramming an entire trade's worth of knowledge into his head and then retrieving it on command. His daughter, the nurse I told you about, talked him into it.
Suppose he likes that he could trust you with his daughter's fucking dirty.
The wardmaster noted. Thomas had to laugh at that. You have no fucking idea, he said, and explained about Branson. The wardmaster saw the humor in it, but also asked,
That shit going to splash back on you, son?
We thought of that, he said, and explained how they'd worked out the timing so that he'd be settled into the job by the time the trap was sprung. He'll be furious, but he isn't one to take it out on the bloke who happens to be standing nearest, I'll give him that. They moved on to talking about the 47th and where the survivors had ended up. The wardmaster and Corporal Jessup were at one of the training camps now, dealing with Spanish flu cases among the men who were pouring back into the country from France and Belgium.
Just wanted like hell to be here, but he's working on wards, and they don't want him circulating too much. This flu's infection is hell, and it's a real big fuck up.
He went on to describe the illness. Rapid progression into pneumonia, fevers high enough to cause delirium, and eventually death. And the treatments were lack thereof.
Just about all you can do is try to keep the poor fuckers alive long enough to fight it off. Break the fever down as much as you can. We'll find an aspirin's good for that, besides the usual shit. I'd try to keep her breathing.
It was about then, and about halfway through the bottle of whiskey, that Peter turned up. He'd had a full day at the rehabilitation program, but had agreed to meet them at the pub afterward. Thomas was a bit anxious over what he and the wardmaster would make of each other. Peter braced up and said, Sergeant.
As you were, Corporal,
The wardmaster said dryly, even though Peter wasn't in the army anymore, was even wearing a civilian greatcoat which he'd picked up from Sir H's house a while ago. He kicked out a chair in Peter's direction.
You want a fucking drink?
Peter accepted, and Thomas darted off to the bar for another glass. When he got back, Peter was apparently detailing his work history. "Junior footman at Lady Waterstone's," he was saying. "This is where Thomas and I first got to know each other. It was his first place, so I showed him the ropes a bit." He went on explaining how they'd gone on to work at a number of London houses and didn't, for which Thomas was grateful. Explained that he, Peter, had been steadily working his way up the ladder from junior footman to full footman to first footman and finally valet, while Thomas roamed his way from one place to the next, fucking every gentleman who looked at him twice. So then the war started and Sir H wanted all this man's servants to join up. The butler was too old, but me, the footman, and the chauffeur all went. I wiggled my way into the RAMC because I thought it'd offer decent odds of coming back in one piece. It nearly worked, he added ruefully. The wardmaster asked Peter several questions about where he'd been posted and what he'd done there, and Thomas realized that it was not so much that Peter was reciting his work history as that the wardmaster was interrogating him about it. "And then I pretty much sat out the last 3/4 of the war in a German hospital," Peter added hastily. "We were looking after our own people, British and French prisoners, but we weren't in any danger." "Apart from losing your arm," Thomas pointed out. "That was my own fault, really," Peter said, and explained how nicking his finger on a bit of shrapnel inside a patient and the infection creeping its way up his arm. "Nothing like what happened to Thomas." "Fuck," the war master muttered and knocked back his drink. To Thomas, he said, "You know, son, After a moment, he gave up on finishing that sentence and topped up their drinks instead. Peter talked a bit more about his war, and when that subject had been exhausted, the wardmaster asked, "So what is it you're going to be doing while Barrow's chauffeuring?" Peter didn't even blink before answering, "Keeping house mostly. I've been learning to cook." He went on to explain about his cooking lessons with Miss Entwistle's and his work with Mr. Crawley's cripples. "That'll be finished before long, if we're lucky, but I'm sure I'll find something else to occupy myself after that." "Huh," the wardmaster said and lit a cigarette. After taking several meditative drags from it, he said, "All right, you'll do." It was only then that Thomas realized that what he'd just been watching was the wardmaster asking Peter about his intentions. He didn't call Thomas son all the time, and wasn't something he said to everyone. Perhaps Thomas ought to have taken the hint. With that decided, the wardmaster let the conversation move on to lighter ground, mostly talking about Thomas's time at the 47th. When he found out that Peter had never heard the hand story, he told it with even more flourishes, not to mention flex, than when Manning had told it the first time in the barn. "You didn't," Peter said when the wardmaster repeated the Ponzi for public consumption version of what Thomas had said to the handless man. "Would this perchance be the ring in question, my good sir, or some shite like that?" "I did not," Thomas said. "All I did was ask him if it was his." "I wondered about that," the wardmaster said. "You don't normally play the posh fucker quite that hard, but it makes it funnier when you say it was on your fucking arm, mate." "I didn't say that," Thomas admitted. They stayed at the pub until last orders. Thomas vaguely remembered a pie and chips in there somewhere about the time they'd finished the whiskey and moved on to pints. They managed, more through luck than anything, to find their way back to the boarding house where they were staying. They had decided not to press their luck on the subject of Grantham House, which did have its advantages. They had to make sure they acted like brothers when in view of the landlady or the other residents. Branson's hint on the subject had proved helpful there, and they didn't quite dare push the two narrow single beds together. But once they had jammed a chair back under the doorknob, they could cram themselves into one of them for a bit of a cuddle before parting for actual sleep. It was all right, especially knowing that they'd have a proper bed to share before long. If Thomas had passed his exams. "I'm sure you did pass them, love," Peter said. "But even if you didn't, we'll be all right. You know that, don't you?" "I passed them," Thomas said grimly. Peter could nearly see his fur standing on end. It was at long last time for the examination results be posted, and Peter had thought it best to go along with him to see them. Peter had thought Thomas was keyed up before the exams, but for the last few days he'd been practically vibrating. "I know," Peter said. "I'm just saying that our future happiness does not rest entirely on the next hour." Thomas's only answer was a baleful look turned in his direction. It was really almost nearly certain that he had done well, Peter thought. If there was one fault Thomas did not have, it was an excess of self-confidence and optimism. And he certainly seemed knowledgeable enough about motor cars when he was badgering Peter to quiz him on the topic. But Peter also knew that if he had struggled with some part of the course, he'd have rather been shot than admit it. The Institution of Automobile Engineers proper was a rather grand set of buildings between Birdcage Walk and Princess Street, but the chauffeur's school was located in a more modest outbuilding around the back. Thomas steered them to a sort of lounge. It reminded Peter a bit of an orderly's room, where about a dozen men were nervously smoking cigarettes and drinking earned tea. "They aren't posted yet," one of them told Thomas when he entered. "Typical," Thomas said, and got them cups of tea. They took seats near the outskirts of the group, and Thomas lit a cigarette. He'd worked his way through the better part of a pack that morning alone. Thomas was sure it wasn't helping with the vibrating, but you couldn't tell Thomas that. "You must be the brother," the man nearest them said, extending his hand. "I'm Porter." Peter put down his teacup and attempted an expression that would convey that naturally Thomas had spoken of Porter without inviting further questions on the topic. In fact, nearly all Thomas had said about the others in his class was that about half were car-mad lads, too young to have been called up mostly, and most of the rest were coachmen or grooms who'd come back from the war to find their employers in no particular hurry to replace the horses that had been requisitioned for the war effort. Porter looked to be one of the former category. He was about to introduce himself in turn when Porter said, "And you'll be Mr. Barrow as well, of course." Peter knew perfectly well that he meant that as brothers, Peter and Thomas would more likely than not have the same surname, but it still felt oddly warming to hear himself called Mr. Barrow, almost as though they were really married. He waited a moment to see if Thomas would correct the error, and when he didn't, tipped his hat mentally in Branson's direction and said, "Strictly speaking, I'm Mr. Barrow. He's Mr. Thomas Barrow. I'm the elder, you see." Thomas huffed precisely as he would if Peter really did make a point about his being older. "But not my nursemaid," he grumbled and explained. "He's invited himself along to stop me jumping off a bridge after we get the results." The man on Porter's other side scoffed. "You've got nothing to worry about," he said. "You were Talmadge. It's the rest of us who ought to have minders today." Talmadge was the only one of Thomas's classmates Peter actually had heard of. He'd been in the transport corps during the war, and according to Thomas, already knew everything anyway. "Don't know why he's even here," Thomas had said, "unless it's just to show the rest of us up." For the next half hour or so, the men smoked and talked, mostly about exam questions that had given them particular difficulty. Thomas said little apart from the occasional, "Too right," or "Bloody typical." About every 5 minutes, someone would wander off into the passage where the results were due to be posted and return to give a slight shake of his head. Finally, one of them came back and, instead of shaking his head, said thirstily, "They're up." There was a mass migration toward the door. Thomas leaned back in his chair and lit another cigarette. Peter hesitated. "Do you want me to go and look?" "I'll look when I'm done with this," he said, gesturing with the cigarette. From the passage came a variety of sounds of delight and dismay. After a bit, the lad who'd said Thomas had nothing to worry about trudged in. "Not as bad as all that," said the man who was with him. "If you did well enough on the other two, they'll let you take the short course and try the written again." "But did I do well enough?" the youth asked, his voice bitter. Thomas shot him a look that could have been either sympathy or schadenfreude and stubbed out his cigarette, standing up in the same motion. Peter trailed him out into the corridor. The knot of men standing around the board where the results were posted parted to let Thomas through. There were 3 lists posted, and when Thomas got close enough, he saw that it was one for each examination. Written, practical, and driving. Thomas said, looking at the first, then typical, as he read the next, and bloody hell on the third. Worried, Peter elbowed his way through the crowd. The list for the written exam read 1. Barrow, 2. Talmadge, and so on. The practical went 1. Talmadge, 2. Barrow, and for the driving test, 1. Talmadge, 2. Porter, 3. Barrow. Oh, for pity's sake. That's what you were worried about, Peter demanded. Whether you beat this Talmadge person. I told you I knew I'd passed, Thomas said in an injured tone. It's hardly my fault you didn't believe me. The trouble with pretended brotherly bickering was that it was difficult to tell when Thomas actually meant what he said. This time Peter suspected he might. I did believe in you, he said. I just thought maybe the instructors got it wrong. Turning away from the lists, Thomas said, It was the 3-point time that got me on the driving one. You know I have trouble with those. I know, Peter agreed. Come on, let's get a bite. Thomas, Peter said, smiling as though they had last seen each other months ago instead of about a quarter of an hour when, after they'd both walked up from the train station, Thomas had gone back in one of the cars to get their luggage. Miss Hughes was just telling me that she and Anna have given our cottage a thorough spring cleaning, so it's all ready for us. Have they? Thomas asked a little warily as he entered the servants' hall. He couldn't help bracing himself for the moment when this all blew up in their faces. Mr. Ronson left it in a bit of a state, Miss Hughes confirmed with a glance at Anna. And never do know what they're doing when it comes to keeping house. There was a moment of awkward silence until Anna said, Present company accepted, I'm sure. We'll return the favor when you and Mr. Bates set up home, Peter told her. Thomas was itching to go and see the cottage now that it was properly theirs. But before he could figure out a way to hustle Peter out the door, Daisy turned up and started pouring more tea into the cup that was sitting in front of Peter. Do you want one too, Thomas? It's Mr. Barrow now, he reminded her. And yes. Placidly, she fetched another cup from the sideboard. How was it in London? Was it strange being back in school? It was fun, Thomas said. He was at the head of the class in the written examination, Peter said proudly. Thomas huffed. Now they were bound to ask about the others, and sure enough, Anna did. And you did all right on the others? Yes, Thomas said in a tone that he hoped would communicate that he didn't wish to discuss the matter further. Anna, Miss Hughes, and even Daisy exchanged a look. Well, as long as you passed them, Miss Hughes said kindly. He was second and third on the other shoe, Peter explained, but he wanted to be first in all 3. Miss Hughes laughed. Now, that I believe. They chatted a bit more, Miss Hughes and Anna amusingly describing the slovenly condition in which Branson had left such vital areas as the floor under the dresser and the grease trap in the kitchen sink until Carson darkened the doorway. Thomas stood up, and Peter and Anna as well, but somehow Carson still managed to look down his nose at him. Mr. Barrow, he said with sarcastic emphasis. Mr. Carson, Thomas replied flatly. I take it, he said ponderously, that you've passed your course. I have, Thomas agreed. And he did very well, Miss Hughes added. First in the class in his written examination. She did not mention the other 2, and Thomas was grateful. He had a feeling that Carson would find second and third places no more impressive than Thomas himself did. Congratulations, Carson said insincerely. But now that you are back, need I remind you that chauffeurs are outdoor stuff? No, Thomas said, reaching for his hat. We only stopped in to let everyone know we were back, and Miss Hughes was kind enough to offer us a cup of tea. It won't happen again. Mr. Barrow, Miss Hughes said, but Thomas was already halfway out the door with Peter hurrying to catch up. Thomas had been a bit glad in a secret soppy sort of way to find that Peter hadn't gone into their cottage without him, so that they could enter their own home for the first time together. He tried not to let Carson spoil the moment. He didn't deserve to spoil it. But he couldn't quite find the light-hearted remarks he'd been planning about carrying across thresholds and how neither of them had the arms for it. So he just opened the door and gestured for Peter to precede him. The front door opened right into the sitting room. There was a fire laid in the grate and lamps filled and trimmed. Peter bustled about lighting them with housewifely efficiency. Thomas wandered into the kitchen and puzzled a bit over the stove. It was a different and more complicated type than he'd encountered in the war. Peter soon followed him in. "Shall we have a cup of tea?" he asked. "All right," Thomas agreed. It might take the taste of the last one out of his mouth. Peter did a bit more bustling, and this time Thomas paid attention so that he'd know how to operate the stove. After their cuppa, they set about unpacking. Thomas had vaguely envisioned getting a hall boy to take their trunks up the narrow staircase to the bedrooms, but he was in no mood to ask Carson for any favors, so they hauled them up between them. They put Thomas's in the front bedroom, the one with the double bed, and Thomas would have done the same with Peter's, but Peter steered them instead into the smaller room. "Suppose it is a bit more discreet to keep your stuff in here," he admitted. The cottage offered more privacy than either of them had ever had in their lives, but they still had to be prepared for the possibility that someone might poke their nose in. Peter said. "This one can be my dressing room. You can banish me to it when we quarrel, like Lady Grantham does." Peter could make anything all right. Thomas sometimes forgot that, but that was all right too, because then he got to discover it again. It wasn't quite usual for married couples of the Crawleys class to share a bedroom. That was why Lord Grantham's dressing room had a bed in it, for the look of the thing. "Right," he said, grinning like a fool. "Except we're not going to quarrel." He hoped that anyway. "Not sure why you get the dressing room, though." "Because I've got a valet," Peter said, leaning over and kissing his cheek. "Oh, yeah?" Thomas pretended to misunderstand. "Is he any good?" "I was very lucky to get him," Peter answered. "He's lucky, too, not to have to give it up. Now he's taken up chauffeuring." It was Peter's usual sort of putting a good face on things, pretending it was all right that he couldn't dress himself now. But as he said it, the world tilted a bit on its axis, and Thomas laughed out loud. Laughed, in fact, until tears came to his eyes. Looking at him with some concern, Peter said, "It wasn't that funny." Thomas shook his head. "It's just..." He chuckled again. "Bloody hell! Before you came back, when I was trying to sort out what I do for a job, they all kept saying I ought to valet a crippled gentleman. I got so sick of hearing it. And now," he gestured vaguely, "they were right. Just not the way they thought." "Thomas Barrow," Peter said. "Professional chauffeur, amateur valet." "Oi!" Thomas protested. There was nothing amateurish about his valeting. "Thank you very much." Peter kissed him again. "Amator," he said. "From the Latin amare, to love." Sometime later they were lying on the double bed, Thomas's head on Peter's chest, when Peter said, "Oh, damn." Thomas's warm lassitude fled. "What?" "I was just thinking about having our first supper in our cottage," Peter explained. And we really ought to have gone to the shops earlier. They will be shutting any minute." Neither of them had ever had to think about things like that before. Meals had always just appeared in the servants' hall, from which they were now banished. "Oh," Thomas said, sitting up. "Well, I suppose we'll not go over to the house and ask Miss Patmore if they could borrow a cup of everything. That was for sure and certain." "Have to get our supper at the pub." "Unless Branson has left something behind," Peter agreed. "And it'll be tea and cigarettes for breakfast tomorrow, but I'll get something nice for elevensies and bring it to you in the garage." "Perfect," Thomas said and leaned down to kiss him again. After tidying themselves up a bit and putting their clothes back in order, they went downstairs to investigate the larder. Branson had indeed left some things: a tin of sardines, a tin of baked beans, and a box of salt. Peter said. Thomas quite agreed. They were still trying to decide which option was less unappealing, going out in public or having their first dinner in their new home be beans and sardines, when there was a knock at the door. Belatedly, it occurred to Thomas that being the chauffeur, he might very well be supposed to drive somewhere, to fetch the Dowager or Miss Crawley, or both from the village for dinner, for example. He ought to have found out from Carson if there was any driving to be done that day, but Carson had been too busy being rude, so... Peter went and answered the door. "Anna," Thomas heard him say, "do come in." When Thomas got to the front room, Anna was standing there with a basket over her arm. "Miss Pat will fix this up for you," she said, handing the basket to Peter. "We thought you might not have had time to get to the shops." "We were just discussing exactly that," Peter admitted. Leading Anna back to the kitchen, he explained about the beans. "We were trying to decide whether to eat them or get our supper at the pub." "Well, perhaps this will help you make a decision," Anna said. Peter offered Anna a cup of tea, and while he was making it, Thomas took the opportunity to ask her if she knew anything about anyone needing the motor that evening. "Mr. Carson didn't mention it, but as you saw, he had other things on his mind." "I don't think so," Anna said. "The Dowager isn't expected, nor Miss Crawley. Dr. Carson's gotten busy, and she's been helping him." "Spanish flu?" Thomas asked. Anna nodded. "Just a few cases so far." She went on to bring them up to date on the village and household news, the progress of plans for Mr. Matthew and Lady Mary's wedding taking pride of place among the latter. They were determined to marry as soon as he was well enough to walk down the aisle, and, since Dr. Clarkson was unable to shed much light on when that might be, were in the absurd situation of trying to plan a wedding when they didn't know when it was going to happen. "And what about you?" Peter asked. "Have you and Mr. Bates set a date yet?" Anna pressed her lips together. "There's been a..." She swallowed hard. "Don't tell me he's thrown you over," Peter said. Thomas could almost see him queuing up the "he's a cad who doesn't deserve you" speech. Thomas had heard that one so many times he ought to have had it memorized. "No, nothing like that," Anna said hastily. "But we found out why the police keep asking him questions, and why they haven't ruled Vera's death as suicide." "Why?" Thomas asked. "She wrote a letter," Anna explained, "just before Mr. Bates went down to see her the final time. She wrote about how angry he was when he telephoned to arrange for them to meet." Peter frowned. "And?" Anna looked down at her hands. "And that she feared for her life." It took Thomas a moment to see it. "That bloody bitch!" he said with an unworthy but undeniable crumb of admiration. Peter, "Sweet lovely Peter," looked between the two of them in confusion. "I don't understand." "She framed him," Thomas said, lighting a cigarette, "for her own suicide." "Really?" Peter asked. "Are you sure it isn't—" He shook his head, apparently unable to come up with something else it could be. "She said she'd ruin him if it was the last thing she ever did," Anna said. "And that's precisely what she did," Thomas finished. "What are you going to do now?" "I don't know," she said. "The police showed his lawyer the letter. It isn't clear why, but the lawyer says it might be that they hope to scare him into doing something that will help to build a case against him. So we really don't dare do anything in case it's twisted to look like the final bit of evidence that they need." Thomas knew that one very well. If you were already presumed guilty, nothing you did could look innocent. Peter didn't, though. "Surely the lawyer has told them that she had no way of preventing the divorce," he pointed out. "Doesn't that do away with his motive?" Anna sighed. "His mother died recently. Well, not so recently now, early in the war. She left some money, and a house in London is in a neighbourhood which is becoming fashionable. Since he inherited it well before the divorce proceedings were underway, her lawyer can argue that she's entitled to some of it, maybe even half. I'd have given her all of it if that's what it took to get rid of her. We both would, but the police don't believe that." "Oh," Peter said. Anna went on. "Part of the trouble is that he began really pressing for the divorce just after his mother died. It was because he thought the money would help to persuade her. He was sending a part of his wages, and we both thought, that she might be more willing to give that up if she could get a significant sum settled on her all at once. But the police think it was me that wanted it. They said it made sense of why a pretty young woman would want to marry an old cripple if it would get me out of service and set up in a comfortable home. I tried to explain that it wasn't like that, but they wouldn't listen.
Thomas missed the significance of this, but Peter didn't. They questioned you.
She nodded. Just once, so far. Now that Peter had pointed it out, that really didn't sound good.
When was that?
Thomas asked. Last week, Anna said. It sounded, in fact, as though they were closing in.
This lawyer, is it the one who was handling the divorce?
Anna nodded.
He needs one with experience in...
Thomas couldn't quite bring himself to say capital cases.
This kind of thing. The bloke he's got might be able to recommend someone, or Mr. Matthew, or his lordship's legal man. Pull all the strings you've got, call in every favour you own to find somebody good and get him to take the case.
Won't that look suspicious? Anna asked.
It'll look like he sees which way the wind is blowing and he's not an idiot, Thomas said bluntly. They've as good as told him that he's the chief suspect in a murder. At this point, acting like he doesn't know it might be even more suspicious than acting like he does. Nobody's that innocent unless they've got something to hide.
Anna, her face very pale, twisted her hands in front of her.
Has he told them about the perjury?
If he hadn't, then he did have something to hide. She shook her head. Do you think he should?
At this point, it might be too late. He should ask his new lawyer that question.
Anna looked over at Peter. Is he... She trailed off. I mean, do you...
Peter apparently was able to figure out what she was trying to say. We don't know anyone who's been suspected of murder, he said. Other things, though. This kind of circling around is usually where gentlemen of our sort hastily arrange a trip to France or some other country under the Napoleonic Code. Mates shouldn't do that,
Thomas added before Anna could get any ideas. The point was to go to a country where certain offences were not recognized as criminal, and there was no place where that was true of murder.
It's an admission of guilt. They just usually don't bother going after them for our sort of thing. He's got no choice but to stand and fight.
I see, Anna said faintly. Peter poured her another cup of tea. She wrapped her hands around it, saying, I've put a damper on your homecoming.
Don't worry about that,
Peter told her. They left unsaid that she had plenty else to worry about. She left not long after that. The dressing gong would be going any minute, and murder case or not, she still had to dress the young ladies. And Thomas and Peter set about unpacking Miss Patmore's basket and fixing a simple supper of eggs and toast. Peter was a bit subdued, but Thomas felt, guiltily, a bit lighter. He'd known something was going to go wrong. Now it had, and it wasn't happening to them. The next few days passed quietly. Thomas worked on the cars and drove various members of the family hither and yon. Peter got the kitchen set up to his liking and turned out meals of increasing complexity. Thomas chafed a bit at being cut off from the gossip in the servants' hall, but Anna took it upon herself to deliver most of the family's requests for the motor and filled him in on the essentials then. She treaded lightly around the topic of Bates's legal troubles. That Mr. Matthew had been helpful on the subject of criminal lawyers was about the most she said, and excessively voluble on the subject of Lady Mary and Mr. Matthew's wedding plans. Thomas was waiting rather anxiously for some hint of when Lady Sybil's wedding plans would be dropped like a high-explosive shell into their lives, but Anna didn't say much about that either, except that Branson had been spotted in the village. He was staying at the pub, apparently, and people were starting to wonder why he was hanging about. Branson himself turned up one afternoon on the excuse of going over the maintenance logs for the motors with Thomas. He would have been insulted, except that it was transparent that Branson was actually hoping to bump into Lady Sybil. He might still have acted insulted, except that Peter happened to be there at the time. Funnily enough, Thomas said when Branson started repeating himself on the subject of when it would be time to recharge the batteries in the touring car, she doesn't hang about the garage much now, or at all, as far as I've noticed. She hadn't even stopped by to catch a cigarette, which Thomas was a little surprised about. Branson sighed. Am I that obvious? Yes. After giving him a dirty look, Branson said, Can you get a message to her? If it can go through Anna, I can get it to her by dinner time. Thomas said. Otherwise, it'll have to wait until she wants to be driven somewhere. After a moment's thought, Branson said, Just ask Anna to let her know that I've got news.
All right.
Thomas was fairly sure that his tone had conveyed absolutely no interest in hearing what the news was, because he felt none, but Branson was apparently bursting to tell someone. I've gotten a job, he said. That's one of the things, besides you, that we've been waiting for, but it's all arranged now.
Congratulations,
Peter said.
What sort of job?
It's on a paper, Branson said, in Dublin. Thomas didn't know that Branson knew anything about printing.
Doing what?
Branson looked a little sheepish. Writing. Well, wasn't he just dipped in shit? Marrying Lady Sybil, and now he was going to be middle class.
Oh,
Thomas said flatly. How exciting, Peter added. It's a free Irish paper, Branson explained. I sent them a letter after the Easter Rising, and they printed it. I sent a few more, and they liked what I had to say, so they asked me to write a proper article. I've done a few now, and when I saw they were looking for a reporter, he shrugged. I thought they might lunch themselves sick when they got my application, but I suppose they thought it was more important to have someone with the right opinions than experience in journalism.
I'm sure you'll do well,
Peter said. I hope so, Branson admitted. The paper's on a shoestring budget. I can make a better wage as a garage mechanic, but I want her to be able to hold her head up when she tells people what to do for a living.
Oi,
Thomas said.
He means people of her class,
Peter told him.
Didn't you?
Exactly, Branson said with a grateful nod. She says she wouldn't be ashamed to be the wife of a garage mechanic, but she likes this better. I know she does. I might pick up some repair work to help with the money, but she can tell people I'm a journalist.
I expect you've got a knack for it,
Peter said encouragingly,
or they wouldn't have shown an interest in the first place.
After a few more remarks on that theme, he left, reminding Thomas to, Just say I've got news. I want to tell her the rest myself. Thomas duly passed the message to Anna, who received it without a sign of curiosity as to its import, and the next day Lady Sybil did, in fact, turn up at the garage. Or perhaps it was Nurse Crawley, because the first thing she said was, I'm sorry we haven't had a chance to talk properly since you've been back. The only time they'd talked at all was when he'd driven her and Lady Mary to pay some calls. She'd said that he looked smart in his new uniform, and he'd said,
Thank you, my lady. I expect you've been busy, he said tactfully. Am I taking you down to the village?
She blushed. I've just been. That was one of the things I wanted to talk to you about. We're going to announce things tonight.
Thomas felt a bit cold. I see.
It was all very well to say that his lordship wasn't the sort to take his anger out on the servants, but it wasn't completely out of the question that he might catch on to the fact that Thomas had been an active participant in the conspiracy. It has been long enough, hasn't it? She asked anxiously.
I think so. If it wasn't, a few more days weren't going to make a difference. She spoke a bit about Branson's newspaper job, making it sound a bit grander than Branson had.
I think that'll help, don't you? Thomas hesitated. Sergeant, she added.
Maybe once they scrape your Lord Father off the ceiling, he said. Not to mention carrying Carson out of the house feet first. She looked crestfallen.
You really think it'll be that bad?
Obviously. I give decent odds on their coming round once they realise there's nothing they can do to stop it, he said. But the idea is going to take some getting used to, and no mistake. She took a deep breath and squared her shoulders.
There isn't anything they can do to stop it, she said, reminding herself, Thomas thought. I'm 21. I don't need Papa's permission to marry. All he can do is take away my marriage portion, and I don't care about that.
Thomas hesitated again.
I don't, she said.
Look, have you spoken to Anna or anyone about that side of things?
Mary's given me an earful about it, she said ruefully.
Lady Mary didn't know either. It's a lot easier not to care about money when you've got enough of it. You've never had to miss a meal, or do without a fire on a cold day, or decide what to do when you've got 2 or 3 kids who need coats, and you only have money for one. She started to protest, and he added, I'm not saying that will happen. Branson's got a bit put by, and he's got good prospects. There's a decent wage in garage work if journalism doesn't work out. Chances are you'll be comfortable. Not like up there. He gestured in the direction of the big house. but comfortable by regular people's standards. I'm sure you've thought about what that'll be like. Living in a small house, doing your own cooking, not having servants. Maybe a scrub woman a few days a week if you're lucky.
I have, she said. I'm ready for all of that.
I know, he said, but things go wrong all the time. You know that. Things go wrong for your lot too. The difference is, when you're working class, it only takes a couple of blows in a row to knock you off your feet. And it can take a long time to get back up if there's nobody to give you a hand.
She swallowed hard.
I'm not trying to frighten you out of it, Thomas added. I just wanted to make sure you know what you're getting into. What's his family think of it?
They're starting to come round, she said.
Good.
He nodded and lit a cigarette, offering her the case. She took one and he lit it for her.
They're not too badly off, I think, by our lot standards, he added. If things go south for you, they'll be able to help. His uncle with a garage, for instance. There's probably a job there for him if he needs it badly enough. But my point is, working class people don't get to not care about money. Not if you care about eating food and sleeping indoors. She took a slow pull from her cigarette.
I hadn't quite thought of it like that, she admitted.
Why would you have? But till now, you've only ever thought about money when you wanted something extra. Food and coal just appear, don't they?
She huffed a little. You make me sound awfully naive.
We've all got our blind spots, Thomas said. You know, our first evening back, Peter and I realized we'd have to cook our own dinner, but we didn't think of going to the shops to get something to cook until after they'd shut.
She giggled.
What did you do? Miss Patmore guessed we'd make that mistake and sent a few things over, Thomas admitted, which goes back to what I was saying about having somebody to give you a hand up. It's not a bad life if you've got that. He took a drag from his cigarette. I suppose what I'm really saying is that while his lordship is hitting the ceiling, don't burn your bridges. You're not going to come crawling back because you're tired of not having somebody to brush your hair for you, or of not getting half a dozen new dresses a year. You're stronger than that, but there may come a time when you need them. She looked skeptical and he hurried on. If Bronson gets hurt and can't work, say, or you've got a child who deserves more education than you can afford, don't say or do anything that'll make asking for help even harder than it already will be. He thought of an incident or two, including his confrontation that she had witnessed part of, and added, That's advice I could have stood to take a few times myself. He was lucky, and he knew it, that he hadn't burnt every bridge he had.
I'll keep it in mind, she promised. Now she hesitated. I'll miss you, you know. You're the only person who speaks to me like this.
Outrageously impertinently, you mean? I'd have thought Branson had that covered.
It isn't quite the same, she laughed. No, I don't know. Like my being a lady is something we can put to one side without pretending it doesn't matter at all. Now that was the thing Thomas hadn't quite thought of like that. But he supposed he had a lot of practice in that sort of thing. Just with gentlemen rather than ladies.
I'll write to you if you like, he said. Keep you up to date on all the Downton gossip. As much of it as he was hearing these days at any rate, which ought to be enough for Nurse Crawley.
I'd like that, she said. And if you and Peter ever find yourselves in Dublin, you should come round for tea. It didn't seem likely that they would, unless he was driving some of the family there to see her, in which case he'd not be going round for tea. But he appreciated the invitation just the same.
The next day, Thomas felt his disconnection from the Downton grapevine even more acutely. His orders for the day included ferrying the Dowager and Miss Crawley to the house for dinner, but he had no way of knowing whether that would put a spike in Branson and Nurse Crawley's plans or not. If anything unusual was happening around dinner time, it did not literally shake Downton on its foundations, so Thomas knew nothing of it. When the time came for him to drive the two ladies back to the village, Carson's fixed expression as he handed them into the car was suggestive but not conclusive, as was the way that, during the short drive, they spoke determinedly of the weather and nothing else. Usually they took the opportunity to sling a few barbs at one another.
I'll be at the Grantham Arms in the village until Lady Sybil is ready to make her departure, Mr. Branson said, his voice carefully pleasant. Mr. Carson, having proclaimed a moment ago that he wouldn't disgrace himself by discussing the topic, limited his response to harumphing and turning a sort of puce shade, and I really did wonder if he was going to make himself ill. I bid you all a good day, Branson added, and left. As soon as his footsteps had receded, Jane said, Is it really true?
Please!
Carson nearly shouted.
I have asked for silence, and silence I will have.
They all gave it to him. On this particular occasion, Anna was relieved that Thomas wasn't with them. She doubted he'd have kept silent. Anna had learned Lady Sybil's news last night. Lady Sybil had told her about it when Anna was undressing her, but Mr. Carson had managed to keep it a secret from the rest of the servants until Branson had turned up in the servants' hall and announced it himself. An ill-timed announcement, perhaps, but Anna was relieved to no longer be the only one downstairs, apart from Mr. Carson, who knew. After what had to have been the quietest luncheon in the history of the Downton servants' hall, Anna made some excuse to slip outside and hurried over to the garage. It was empty, apart from the cars, so she went across to the cottage and knocked on the door. Mr. Fitzroy answered it. "Hello," he said. "Come in. We're just having lunch."
"Oh,"
she said. Of course they were.
"I don't mean to interrupt."
"As long as you don't mind us eating in front of you," he said with one of his strange-looking shrugs. "Has something happened?"
She hesitated. "Not with Mr. Bates, if that's what you mean."
"Ah," he said, ushering her down the passage toward the kitchen. "It'll be the other thing, then." Thomas glanced up from his sandwich when she entered. "What?" he said wearily. With a glance at Mr. Fitzroy, she said,
"I think you may already know. Mr. Branson's just told us all that he and Lady Sybil are going to be married."
Swallowing, Thomas asked, "How'd they take it, upstairs?"
"His lordship was furious,"
she said, taking the seat that Mr. Fitzroy offered to her.
"Lady Sybil said he accused Mr. Branson of seducing her and tried to forbid it and said she was throwing away her life."
Mr. Fitzroy fetched a teacup and poured her some.
"I'm not sure about her ladyship,"
she continued. Lady Sybil had mentioned an almost funny moment where her ladyship had gotten the, fortunately, wrong impression that Lady Sybil and Mr. Branson were planning to live in sin. And I suppose that may even have helped a bit by putting in her ladyship's mind how it could have been worse.
"But she says the Dowager took it better than she expected."
"I think she's got a past," Thomas noted. "The Dowager, I mean. I've heard a thing or two." Anna had too. Waiting at table was surprisingly informative. Returning to the subject of Lady Sybil, she said,
"They're all trying to talk her out of it, of course, but if you ask me, her mind's made up."
Thomas, who had just taken a bite, nodded. Mr. Fitzroy said, "She does seem a strong-minded young lady." Anna, unsure how much they already knew, shared a few more details. Their plans to live in Dublin, Mr. Branson's job on the newspaper. Thomas finished his lunch with a single-mindedness she'd never seen in him, not directed at food, at least, and bolted, muttering something about lots of work to do. Only halfway through his own lunch, Mr. Fitzroy watched him go with a slight frown.
"What's gotten into him?"
Anna asked. "I'm not sure. He and Nurse Crawley had a longish talk yesterday, I know that."
"I always forget that he's friends with Lady Sybil,"
Anna admitted. Forget wasn't quite the word for it. It was just something she had trouble holding in her mind. "He's friends with Nurse Crawley," Mr. Fitzroy corrected with a smile. "The distinction is a vital one. To him, at least."
"I don't think it is to her,"
Anna said with a bit of uncertainty. From what she had gathered, Lady Sybil's friendship with Thomas was franker than the one she and Anna shared, which was always tempered by the difference in their status. "Perhaps not, but she understands it," Mr. Fitzroy said. He smiled fondly as he went on. "When they're going to really talk beyond the yes, my lady, and no, my lady business, she calls him Sergeant, and he calls her Nurse Crawley. It's sort of adorable." Anna knew by now that Mr. Fitzroy would find nearly anything Thomas did to be adorable, but on this, she could see his point.
"He and Mr. Carson had an actual row over Mr. Carson calling him Thomas instead of Sergeant Barrow. His lordship had to intervene."
"That sort of thing's important to him," Mr. Fitzroy said. "He likes to know where he stands with people."
"I hadn't thought of it like that," Anna admitted. "I thought it was just that he's a snub."
"Well, there's that too," Mr. Fitzroy said. He was about finished with his lunch then, and after helping him clear the table, Anna went looking for Thomas. The reminder of his and Lady Sybil's friendship had given her an idea of what might be bothering him. When she found him in the garage, he was under the bonnet of the larger car, doing something with a wrench. He glanced up at her and made a sound that might have passed for a greeting among cave-dwelling ape-men, then returned his attention to his work. Anna perched on the high stool that stood near the workbench, the one where Mr. Fitzroy often sat when he was in the garage. She'd not been invited to sit, but she knew from experience that she'd not have been even if Thomas was in a far better mood than he was now.
"I'll be sorry to see Lady Sybil go," she began, "even though I know it's what she wants. I suppose we all will."
Thomas glanced over at her.
"It'll be even duller around here without her, that's for sure."
So that wasn't it. If the prospect of missing Lady Sybil was the cause of his surliness, he'd have said something like, "What difference will it make to the likes of us? One less of them to wait on and drive about." She tried another possibility.
"It's a bit of a surprise, Mr. Brownson getting a job on a paper. I didn't know he was a writer."
Jealousy was always a good bet when it came to Thomas. It might smart a bit to see Mr. Branson move on from the trade that Thomas had so recently taken up.
"It's not exactly the London Times," Thomas pointed out, "or even the Dublin Times, just some Irish Republican rag."
His voice grew a bit muffled as he leaned under the motor's bonnet again.
"He only applied for it because he thought them upstairs might find it a bit easier to swallow if Nurse Crawley can say he's a professional instead of a tradesman."
And I wondered a bit how Thomas knew so much about it, but then he had spent a lot of time with Mr. Branson before he'd gone on his course. In any case, he sounded no more than averagely envious, by his standards, of Mr. Branson's good fortune.
"Lady Sybil mentioned that as well, that it would sound better for the Dowager Countess."
Seemingly finished with whatever he was doing to the car's innards, Thomas circled round it, lighting a cigarette.
"Look," he said, "she didn't want me telling anyone about her plans. And it's not like she told me, really. It just sort of got obvious when we were working on this."
He gestured at the motor, apparently meaning his job as chauffeur.
"I couldn't say anything because she was the one convincing his lordship to let me have the job."
Now Anna understood. Or thought she did. Glancing over her shoulder for any eavesdroppers, she said,
"I don't think I'd have turned them in either if I had known in advance. I do wonder if she's doing the right thing, but it's her decision who she wants to marry."
If they'd been carrying on, Anna might have chosen differently, but Lady Sybil had assured her that nothing like that was taking place, and there was nothing in the state of her clothing to suggest otherwise.
"You knew about that there was something between them," Thomas said. His tone was faintly accusatory, which really didn't make much sense. They'd spoken about it a time or two, so of course she knew. "Same as I did. And Lady Mary."
"Yes,"
she agreed.
"Just don't go getting any ideas about telling them I knew," he said, "when you knew almost as much as I did."
Anna stared at him. Mr. Bates had joked about Thomas reverting to his old prickly ways, but this, the Thomas who expected betrayal at every turn and collected blackmail material as a shield against it, she hadn't seen since before the war. Or even longer than that, since before Kew Gardens. Since the time he tried to blackmail her into chaperoning his and Mr. Fitzroy's date. Back then, she remembered, she hadn't known whether to slap him or feel sorry for him.
"I didn't say you were going to," he retorted. "Just if you were thinking about it."
"Well, I wasn't,"
she said with a hint of exasperation. Perhaps more than a hint. With a look of genuine alarm, he said,
"Wasn't?"
It took her a moment to catch up.
"And I'm not now either."
He squared his shoulders and raised his chin in that way that reminded her of a cat that had just been caught falling off a chair or doing something similarly inelegant, and was now attempting to convey that it had been done so on purpose, perhaps as an example to less able cats.
"You'd best not be," he muttered. "I haven't even done anything else."
Now it was Anna's turn to seize on a single suggestive word.
"Else? What have you already done?"
Thomas took a pull from his cigarette and squinted at her.
"Not telling you about Nurse Crawley running off with a chauffeur?"
Why would she expect him to tell her that? She began to ask exactly that, but only got as far as, "Why would—" before the answer struck her like a blow. They'd first become friends around the time of his falling out with Miss O'Brien, a rupture that had resulted from Thomas's refusal to tell her what had really happened between Lady Mary and the Turkish gentleman. She'd be a little insulted that anyone would think she'd act like Miss O'Brien did, except that it was Thomas. He knew a million signs that someone was about to do something awful, but he had no idea whatsoever of how to tell if someone wasn't.
"I'm not Miss O'Brien," she said. "I wouldn't plot revenge against a friend because they didn't tell me something. That was none of my business to begin with."
Thomas did the offended cat maneuver again and echoed his earlier sentiment. "I didn't say you would."
"If you ask me, it's a despicable thing to do,"
she added. Miss O'Brien's turning her back on him may have worked out for the best. Anna fancied herself a better friend than Miss O'Brien could ever be. But he hadn't deserved it. She wondered if anyone had ever told him so. Thomas had just finished replacing the batteries in the touring car after testing their specific gravity when Miss Hughes turned up. "Mr. Barrow," she called. He circled round the car, wiping his hands on a rag. She looked worried. "Yes?"
"Mr. Carson's been taken ill," she explained.
Thomas glanced at the cars. "Shall I go for Dr. Clarkson?" The touring car needed a few more minutes' work before it would be ready to drive, but if there was a hurry, he could take the Landelot.
"I've telephoned him," she said. "He has several other serious cases, and I don't think Mr. Carson is too terribly ill, so he said he'd come when he has time."
All right, then. Thomas waited to hear what any of this had to do with him.
"But he suggested that you might take a look and telephone again if you think it's more urgent."
"Oh, Carson is going to love that!" "Of course," he said. "Let me just finish what I'm doing here and get tidied up a bit. Not to mention steel himself for the ordeal. 20 minutes or so?"
She nodded. "Thank you."
Once he'd finished with the batteries, Thomas popped back over to the cottage to shed his coverall and put on a tie. He was wearing one of his own suits under the coverall as part of an experiment into whether he could get away with foregoing the wretched chauffeur's uniform when he wasn't expecting to actually drive the family anywhere. Peter walked up to the house with him, reasonably enough if anyone asked, since he had as much medical training as Thomas did, though Thomas suspected his real purpose was a visit with the indoor staff. And indeed, by the time Thomas had rounded up a thermometer, Peter was settled in the servants' hall talking to Daisy as she laid the tea. Well, if Carson was ill in bed, he could hardly take issue with it. Thomas wondered, as he climbed the stairs, if he was actually going to have to wake Carson up. But fortunately, his answering, "What?" when Thomas knocked on the door sounded thoroughly irritated, but not at all sleepy. Letting himself into the room, Thomas explained, "Major, Dr. Clarkson's asked me to take a look at you." Carson, sitting up in bed, harumphed. "He's a bit busy today," Thomas added, "so he wanted me to give him an idea of the urgency of the case." "I'm fine," Carson said. He didn't look too bad, a little flushed, but that was about it. Thomas stuck the thermometer in his mouth and made a bit of a production of taking his pulse. Not that it was terribly relevant in a case of suspected Spanish flu, at least not from what the wardmaster had said, but it gave Thomas something to do while he was waiting for the thermometer reading. It also got him close enough to listen to Carson's breathing, which might be just a hair labored, though it was impossible to tell whether that was the result of illness or huffiness at having Thomas in his bedroom. Throughout the process, Carson looked straight ahead, as though if he didn't look directly at Thomas, this would not be happening. The thermometer showed only a slight fever, a fact which Thomas duly reported to Carson. "Nothing too alarming. Are you feeling dizzy at all, or confused?" "No," Carson said grudgingly. "Headache?" "No." "Fatigue?" "No." He also denied muscle aches, nausea, nasal congestion, and sore throat. "If you haven't got any symptoms at all, I'm not entirely sure why Miss Hughes sent you to bed," Thomas pointed out. Carson found something fascinating to look at on the wall opposite where Thomas was sitting. "There was a bit of dizziness upon standing." He bit off every word. "And some headache and tiredness." "Thank you," Thomas said, and wished he had a proper medical chart upon which to write this information.
Dr. Clarkson will be along when he can. Try to rest.
Back in the servants' hall, he found Peter still talking to Miss Hughes.
We can do to help, he was saying. Thomas, how's the patient? I expect he'll live,
Thomas said, and, thinking of Bates's situation, did not add, unfortunately. Writing down Carson's temperature and pulse, he added,
We ought to check on him again in a couple of hours if Dr. Clarkson hasn't come by then. From what I've heard, it can progress quickly.
Thank you,
Miss Hughes said, and Thomas realized that he had just volunteered to check on Carson again in a couple of hours. Damn.
Will you two stay for tea?
Thomas glanced at Peter, who gave a slight shrug and raised an eyebrow. Thomas shrugged back, and Peter said,
We will, if it isn't an imposition.
None at all,
Miss Hughes said. Daisy was already getting down 2 more plates. Thomas sat down next to Peter.
What have you found out? They've sent for someone called Mr. Molesley to wait at table, Peter said. Miss Crawley's butler, Thomas said. If you can call him a butler when it's just him, a cook-housekeeper, and a daily woman. If he's that unimpressive, I wonder why she didn't ask us to begin with, Peter said.
Well, he does have 2 arms. There was absolutely no way Thomas could say that, so we didn't.
I expect it'll be a bit of a thrill for him waiting at table in a proper house.
Though Thomas would not have admitted it out loud under any circumstances, it was a bit nice being back in the servants' hall, especially without Carson glaring at them from the head of the table. The best part of it, though, was watching the way Peter came alive, following the conversation intently and adding a few sparkling anecdotes about the trials of setting up housekeeping when you've never done it before. Thomas didn't want to be the one to drag them back to their cottage. Cozy, yes, but perhaps a bit lonely for Peter. And no one took it upon themselves to toss them out, so they ended up staying until it was time for Thomas to go and change into his jumpers and knee boots to fetch the Dowager and Miss Crawley from the village. He slipped out while Peter was busy having a recipe explained to him by Miss Patmore. He went to Crawley House first. The Dowager Countess, after much back and forthing on the subject, had concluded that if she must be kept waiting while the widow of a middle-class doctor made herself ready, it was less inferding to do so in her own house than in the car on the street. And as he opened the car door for Miss Crawley, she said,
I expect Lady Sybil's news has made it through the house by now.
Yes, ma'am,
Thomas agreed and closed the door after her. Once he was back in the driver's seat, she continued,
I have to admit, I wasn't completely surprised. She'd made a number of, shall we say, portentous remarks about not wanting to go back to the life she had before the war.
Was she trying to find out how much he'd known? Thomas had thought about the possibility that his lordship might have questions on the subject, but he hadn't anticipated it from Sister Crawley. Although, as ward sister, she had been responsible for the VAD's conduct and moral well-being. It could easily be argued that Thomas, or rather Sergeant Barrow, ought to have reported Nurse Crawley to her.
Yes, ma'am, he said again. I thought she meant she was hoping to find a way to continue nursing.
She is, Miss Crawley said brightly. She plans to find a nursing job in Dublin after the wedding.
Thomas knew that, but said,
Is she, my lady? I'm glad to hear it.
She has a real talent for the work,
Miss Crawley said in a tone of agreement. That conversation took them to the Dower House, at which point Thomas was cut out of the conversation. It didn't matter one bit to Miss Crawley that one did not talk to the chauffeurs, but it mattered a great deal to the Dowager Countess, and apparently Miss Crawley was not today in the mood to antagonize her. After decanting the ladies at the front door and putting the car away, Thomas checked the cottage for Peter. Not finding him there, he walked over to the house. Downstairs was the usual bustle of getting ready for the day's grand production, dinner. But Peter was nowhere to be seen. He wasn't in the servants' hall, or the kitchen, or even in the boot room. He just might, Thomas thought, be talking to Miss Hughes in her sitting room, but then he saw her heading toward him alone.
Where's Peter?
He demanded. She blinked.
He's gone up to check on Mr. Carson,
she said. She went on to say something about Peter reminding them that he had hospital training as well, but Thomas didn't hear it. He was already dashing up the stairs, hoping to get there before Carson had a chance to say anything that would oblige Thomas to beat a man senseless in his sick bed. He was a bit out of breath and hated his knee boots more than ever by the time he got to the men's corridor in the attic. "Sure, Mr. Molesley will have everything under control," he heard Peter say. "Anna's in the servery with him now, making sure he knows how things are done here." Thomas stepped into the doorway in time to see Carson glower, but he didn't actually say anything, so Thomas reined in his temper. "How's the patient?" he asked, aiming for a tone of professional cheer. The look Peter shot him suggested he'd missed the mark by a considerable margin. "About the same. He might feel better if he'd rest instead of fretting about an ordinary family dinner." Carson began to expound upon the Dowager Countess and Miss Crawley and how
Mr. Molesley won't know how to set a table on the scale we do here.
Anna does, Peter reminded him, "but Thomas will take a look at it if it'll make you feel better. Won't you, Thomas?" "Of course," Thomas said, because he could hardly say anything else. He attempted to convey with his expression that he was agreeing because Peter had asked. Carson's answering glower suggested he'd hit that one all right. In the servery, they found Molesley dithering over the wines. Thomas chased him downstairs for the first course. They'd be about finished with their before-dinner drinks in the library, and going into the dining room, twitched a couple of glasses and a candelabra into their proper positions. Not that anyone who'd be in the dining room would notice the difference. Downstairs, Miss Hughes continued to not chase them out, or even to hint that they ought to leave. So they continued to hang about, Daisy laying the table for the downstairs dinner set places for them. About midway through the upstairs main course, Jane escorted a pale and wobbly-looking Molesley into the servants' hall. "He's taken ill," she told Miss Hughes. "Anna's taken over serving upstairs." "Go and help her," Miss Hughes directed, taking Molesley's arm and getting him into a chair. "What can we do to help?" Peter asked. Miss Hughes thought for a moment and said, "Look after him. I'll keep the dinner going." Molesley was looking about in a dazed sort of way, as though we weren't entirely sure why he wasn't in the dining room anymore. Thomas eyed him skeptically. He didn't look ill, precisely. More like... Well, his professional experience of Spanish flu consisted of one possible case, Carson, and hearing the wardmaster talk about it, he'd best not jump to conclusions. When he ran through the same list of questions he'd asked Carson, Molesley confirmed dizziness, confusion, headache, and nausea, and denied chills, muscle aches, nasal congestion, and sore throat. Still best to do the thing thoroughly. Fetching the thermometer, he stuck it in Molesley's mouth, getting a boozy exhalation in return. While he waited for it to read, he got a large glass of water and some bread from the kitchen. Setting these before Molesley, he collected the thermometer, which read dead normal.
How bad is it?
Molesley said, slurring his words slightly. "Depends," Thomas said. "How much of it did you drink?"
What?
Molesley said vaguely. "Drink this," Thomas said, putting the glass in his hand. "And eat that if you think you can keep it down." He indicated the bread. Then he sat down, lit a cigarette, and watched Molesley for signs that he was about to spew, with an eye toward getting him into the scullery, if it seemed likely. Mount Molesley had still refrained from erupting when Anna came down.
"Miss O'Brien," she said, "her ladyship's taken ill as well. You best go up and help put her to bed."
O'Brien muttered something about what Anna had best do, and went. "Do you want me to look at her too?" Thomas asked. It didn't seem entirely proper.
"Lady Sybil and Miss Crawley are looking after her,"
Anna said. "Oh, right, of course, that was much more suitable." "Good." A short while later, Thomas was summoned to drive the Dowager Countess home. Miss Crawley was planning to stick around until Dr. Clarkson came, so naturally the doctor's car passed theirs halfway down the drive. By the time Thomas made it back to the servants' hall, Molesley had dozed off at the table, and Dr. Clarkson, having already examined her ladyship and Carson, was on his way to look at him. "They'll both need some nursing care for the next few days," he was telling Miss Hughes, "but neither seems too serious."
"Thank heavens for that," she said. "Mr. Molesley is just in here."
They stepped into the room and everyone, except Molesley, stood up.
"Sergeant,"
Major Clarkson said, nodding to him.
"Sit up."
Thomas answered and reported, "No fear or respiratory symptoms, but he complains of dizziness, headache, and nausea." As Dr. Clarkson leaned over Mosley to examine him, he let out a fragrant snore. Clarkson straightened quickly. "Right," he said. "Mr. Mosley will be fine in the morning. The other two have Spanish flu. He's just drunk." "I thought that might be the case, sir," Thomas admitted. Dr. Clarkson nodded. "You've been looking after Mr. Carson?" "I've been looking in on him," Thomas agreed, and fetched the sheet of paper where he'd been writing down his temperature and pulse. Studying the makeshift charts, Dr. Clarkson nodded. "Very thorough. You've been taking his temperature every 2 hours?" "Yes, sir." That was about the most often they ever did it in the hospital. "Better safe than sorry, I thought, especially since we had only the one patient to worry about." "This disease can take sudden turns," the doctor agreed, "but I shouldn't be surprised if you have more cases over the next few days. Once Spanish flu gets into a house, it spreads. If you get busier, taking vitals every 4 hours will suffice for a mild case." "Yes, sir," Thomas said. He wondered if that meant he had to examine Carson in the middle of the night. The prospect of getting out of bed and trekking over to the house was only slightly more appealing than that of sleeping in his own room, away from Peter, to avoid the chilly night walk. "What about overnight?" "It's probably more important for him to rest than to wake up him to take his temperature, but it would be best if someone could look in on him," Dr. Clarkson said.
"I'll do that,"
Bates volunteered.
"I can fetch Mr. Barrow from his cottage if there's any cause for concern."
"Very good." Dr. Clarkson nodded. "Miss O'Brien will be doing the same for her ladyship, and fetching Nurse Crawley if she has cause for concern," he added. "Both of you know how to treat a fever, and want signs to look for to tell if a patient's condition is worsening." He went on to give Thomas a few more instructions about Spanish flu, mostly things that Thomas had already heard from the wardmaster, and something about giving the patients cinnamon in warm milk if their condition worsened, which the wardmaster had said was
"about as useful as tits on a fucking bull, but it gives you something to do."
At her age, Miss Hughes supposed she had little to worry about, but it still felt strange to be going into a man's bedroom at night. The much-delayed servants' hall dinner had finally finished, and she'd come up to collect the tray that she'd sent up with one of the hall boys. She half hoped that Mr. Carson would be asleep, though seeing him asleep would be its own sort of awkwardness. But he was sitting up paging through a book. When she entered, he put it aside and demanded a report on how the dinner had gone.
"Well enough for our practical purposes,"
she said. In truth, she hadn't paid much attention, but surely her ladyship's illness would have served as a distraction from any lapses resulting from Mr. Mosley's state of inebriation.
"And we'll manage perfectly well tomorrow too, and the next day, and on until you're fully recovered and ready to go back on duty,"
she added before he could start making noises about being back on his feet tomorrow. He'd tried that when Dr. Clarkson had told him that he'd need to rest for at least several days, and she wanted to make clear that she'd have no more truck with it than the doctor had.
He grumbled a bit more and said, "I suppose Mr. Mosley could be asked to stay on until I'm well."
"I don't think his liver could stand it,"
Miss Hughes said, and before Mr. Carson could ask what she meant by that, she added,
"Mr. Barrow and Mr. Fitzroy had offered their services for the duration of the emergency."
It had been Mr. Fitzroy doing the offering for both of them, but it was plain enough that Thomas would do anything Mr. Fitzroy wanted him to do.
"I dare say we'll be able to manage."
Mr. Carson shook his head.
"Zup!"
"I'm well aware of your quarrel with Mr. Barrow," she said, "but Mr. Fitzroy seems a perfectly pleasant chap."
Not to mention a calming influence on Thomas.
"Perhaps,"
Mr. Carson allowed.
"except that he has no good reason whatsoever for being here. I can't imagine why his lordship chooses to permit it."
"You could ask him,"
Miss Hughes pointed out, and got a baleful look in return.
"You were concerned for him when he was away,"
she added, not very concerned perhaps, but he'd asked after him when she or Anna received a letter from him, and during the long silence that had followed the field postcard notifying them of his injury, he'd unbent enough to say that he hoped Thomas wasn't too badly hurt.
"And when he was first notified that Mr. Fitzroy was presumed dead."
They'd all been a bit taken aback by how Thomas had been knocked flat by his grief, and while Mr. Carson's main concern had been making sure that Thomas didn't make a scene, he'd at least recognized the need to do so in a way that didn't add to the poor boy's burdens.
"Yes, well,"
Mr. Carson said.
He is a great deal easier to sympathize with in the abstract.
He cleared his throat.
The modern thinking on these things is that men like that are made so through some accident of nature which is no fault of their own.
I didn't think you were much of one for modern thinking,
Miss Hughes noted.
There may be something in it in this matter. I can't imagine how any man would choose to be like that. Not even Thomas. No, I can recognize what an affliction it must be.
He said generously.
But the way he shoves it in our faces makes it very hard to feel any pity for him.
Privately, Miss Hughes suspected that Thomas would do even more of what Carson called shoving it in their faces if he knew the alternative was to be pitied. Aloud, she put it more mildly.
I'm not sure he wants to be pitied.
That's the problem,
said Mr. Carson.
He should. He should recognize that he is ill and be grateful for the tolerance he has found here. Instead, he parades about as though there were nothing wrong with him, and now he's making a spectacle of himself play-acting at married life.
Miss Hughes reminded herself that Mr. Carson was, at the moment, ill himself, and that his weakened state probably had something to do with his uncharacteristic frankness on the topic. She decided it was time for some frankness of her own.
If he is ill, she said, and there's no change in it, isn't it for the best that he makes a life with someone who shares his affliction?
What would be for the best is if he resigned himself to a celibate life,
Mr. Carson countered.
Plenty of people have. You and I have.
He said it with a sort of heavy significance that Miss Hughes didn't quite understand.
I haven't resigned myself to anything, she said. I chose this life. I could have married if I had wanted to.
She couldn't have married and had the career she did as housekeeper in one of England's great houses, but she'd made a choice. And Thomas and Mr. Fitzroy, well, they'd found a way to make one too. The next morning, Thomas and Peter reported up to the house after breakfast. 2 of the housemaids had woken up ill, and now Miss Hughes was willing to accept the help that Peter had so rashly offered the day before. They found themselves not only checking on Carson and the sick maids, the latter always with Miss Hughes or Anna accompanying them for propriety's sake, but tending the fires, setting up the dining room for luncheon, accepting deliveries, and a dozen other everyday chores. One small mercy was that O'Brien was blessedly absent from downstairs for most of the day, except when she came down demanding ice, or more cool cloths, or warm milk and cinnamon. Thomas wondered a bit at how much effort she was putting into nursing her ladyship. It didn't seem like the piously devoted goody-two-shoes act she put on when she wanted something, or when she was afraid she might be losing her hold on Lady Grantham. It was almost frantic, like she actually cared. Thomas began to get an idea of why when he was taking firewood up to the family bedrooms. A maid came out of her bedroom carrying a bundle of sheets that had been soaked through with fever sweat, and when he was laying the fire in his lordship's dressing room, he could hear her ladyship wheezing, although the connecting door was shut. He happened to leave the dressing room at the same time as Nurse Crawley, definitely not Lady Sybil, as she was in uniform, was leaving her ladyship's room carrying a basin covered with a cloth. "Would you like me to take that down to the sink room, nurse?" he asked. "Thank you," she said, handing it over. "And could you bring up a clean one?" Unfortunately, since the sink room had turned back into the scullery, there was no ready supply of basins, nor any disgraced orderlies to do the washing up. Thomas left the basin on the draining board, making a mental note to come back and wash it later, and scouted a suitable replacement receptacle from the kitchen. Back upstairs, he knocked on the door and took it in, earning a glare from O'Brien. Nurse Crawley passed her the basin, then accompanied Thomas back out into the corridor. "She seems a lot worse off than any of the others," he said. Nurse Crawley nodded. "Dr. Clarkson says the next few hours—" She hesitated. "Are critical." "Is there anything I can do?" Thomas asked, even though he knew perfectly well that there wasn't. Aspirin, cool cloths, and cinnamon and milk. Those were all they had. She shook her head, her eyes downcast. "I can't help wondering if the quarrel the night before last could have played some part. If the shock weakened his system." "What the bloody hell was he supposed to say to that? I've never heard of hearing that your daughter's about to run off with a chauffeur as a cause for Spanish flu was read out. Plenty of people are dying who didn't just get shocking news, was also no good." Nor was, probably not, but I don't suppose we'll ever know. That one was a little better than the others, but still not something he could actually say. He also wasn't going to say, I'm sure the news had nothing to do with it, because he wasn't sure. Neither of them can be sure. He finally settled on, I suppose it's natural to wonder that, in the circumstances. I wondered about Granny having a stroke or something when we announced it, she admitted. When I arranged with Tom to come, I didn't know she was coming to dinner. But I didn't think about Mamma. You couldn't have known that she was getting ill, Thomas pointed out. No, she agreed. But still, they say it seems completely random who gets a serious case, he added. That was what the Warren Master had said anyway. Sometimes people who are already in hospital when they catch it, they have some other illness or they're still recovering from a wound, only have a mild case. That's true, Nurse Crawley said, looking slightly encouraged. A lot of infants and elderly people are getting milder cases too. Cousin Isabel mentioned that. Thomas nodded. I'm not sure having a weakened system has anything to do with it, really. Perhaps not, she agreed. Her ladyship cried out from the bedroom. Nurse Crawley hurried back inside, and Thomas got back to laying the fires. He got back downstairs just as Daisy and Miss Patmore were bringing the tea into the servants' hall. Isn't Miss O'Brien coming down? Daisy asked as she started pouring. We'll put something aside for her, Miss Patmore said. Daisy concentrated intently on pouring the next few cups. Finally, she asked, Is her ladyship going to die then? Involuntarily, Thomas glanced toward Carson's empty seat. It was just the sort of question that was sure to provoke a reaction from him. But of course he wasn't there. We must hope not, said Miss Hughes gently. Daisy looked at him for some reason. But is she? Not for the first time, Thomas wondered why they seemed to think he ought to know these things. It had been the same way when William and Mr. Matthew were missing. It's bad, he said. Dr. Clarkson is hoping to see some improvement in the next few hours. The rest of the meal, unsurprisingly, was quiet. Afterwards, Peter went with Miss Hughes to take tea to the sick maids, and Thomas went outside to have a smoke. With O'Brien out of the picture, he could have smoked in the servants' hall, but he figured this way there was a better chance of getting through an entire cigarette without someone wanting him to do something. When the door opened behind him, he thought even that modest expectation had been foiled, but it was Anna who came out and took a seat next to him. All right? He asked her. She nodded, opened her mouth, and closed it again. Mr. Bates and I are getting married, she said. I know, he started to say, but she wasn't finished. On Friday, she went on. You see, the lawyer, the new one, agrees with you. What he said was something like, appearances are consistent with the likelihood that the police are developing a case against him, but he meant what you said, that they're getting ready to arrest him. All right, Thomas said slowly. And I decided that if it does happen, we're going to face it together, as man and wife. If she had asked, Thomas would have said that he thought it was a bad move. True, anything Bates did could be interpreted as evidence of guilt, but some things were a lot easier to interpret that way than others. But she wasn't asking. I see. Friday. That's the day the registrar had available, she explained. But with her ladyship so ill, I wonder if we'll be able to get away. So she was asking the same question that Daisy had, really, only less directly. I'd say that by Friday things won't be so uncertain. She'd either have started to get better or not. I suppose not, she said. It isn't what we wanted, she continued. Even though it has to be a registry office wedding, we could have had our friends there and a bit of a party afterwards. But I couldn't bear it if... And I wouldn't even have a right to be informed of what was happening. She didn't have to explain it to him. Bit late to start claiming your brother and sister, he agreed. She laughed a bit hollowly. Right, so this is what we're doing. Maybe it'll satisfy her vengeful ghost, Thomas suggested, knowing she'd cheated you out of a proper wedding. Maybe, Anna agreed. Probably not, but it would be nice if it did. Almost the moment they went back inside, Peter came down the stairs and dragged Thomas back out into the courtyard again. Once Thomas had lit a cigarette for him, just the one, since Thomas had just finished one, he said, Miss Hughes was worrying over what they're going to do about dinner. Thomas frowned. Did you go to Carson's room? Yes, and it was fine. Peter said. He's too ill to be awful at the moment. I told her we'd be glad to help. It took Thomas a moment to realize that he'd gone back to the original subject of Miss Hughes worrying about the dinner. Then it took him another moment to rein in his temper, and a third to not say, Why the bloody hell did you say that? You volunteered us to wait at table. Yes, Peter said, as if there were no glaringly obvious reason why he ought not to have done that. With Mr. Carson down for the count, they can survive you serving them from the wrong side, he pointed out, especially as there's no guests. And I can do the wine. You only need one hand for that. Thomas had no doubt that they could survive being served from the wrong side. The question was whether he could survive doing it. With Peter there, maybe. He lit another cigarette, this one for himself. Peter watched him with a sort of patient understanding. It was his, I know you'll do the right thing after you've thought about all the other options face. This time, thinking about all of the other options didn't take very long because every single one of them started with, Disappointing Peter! He sighed and took a long drag from his cigarette. Blowing the smoke out slowly, he said, Guess we'd better find you a livery. I was thinking a sort of buffet, Miss Patmore said. That way they can go in and out as it suits them. You don't mind the extra work? Miss Hughes asked. It was an ideal solution, and not only for the problem of the family being all too likely to be called away from the table by her ladyship's illness. When Mr. Fitzroy had volunteered himself and Thomas to serve at dinner, there hadn't been any way to ask how precisely they meant to do it. At times like this, we all must pull together, Miss Patmore said. I quite agree, she said. Mr. Fitzroy said that he and Mr. Barrow would serve. Oh, he's waiting at table again now, is he? Miss Patmore asked. I suppose even he'd have a hard time standing next to poor Mr. Fitzroy and saying his shoulder's too bad to let him do it. I gather he can just about manage, she said, just not in the style that Mr. Carson expects. A buffet shouldn't give him much trouble, though that in itself would take a bit of managing. If Thomas got the impression they didn't think he was up to serving a proper dinner, he was bound to take offense. I've always liked how you look in livery, Thomas said, smoothing Peter's lapels. They were back in their cottage, Thomas having just finished altering one of the spare liveries to fit Peter. Me too. Peter preened a little in front of the mirror. I think what you're supposed to say is that you like the way I look in it too, Thomas pointed out. I do, Peter said, but you look good in a sack, and you know it. Thomas could have denied either part of that, and so he didn't try, just quickly changed into his own livery. No alterations needed, since no one had touched it since he'd left for the war. Returning to the house, they went to the kitchen to find out what the menu was, so they could start figuring out the table setting and the wines. Miss Patmore, instead of telling them, sent Daisy to fetch Miss Hughes. If they'd decided to call the drunk in again after Thomas and Peter had gone to the trouble of getting into livery, he was going to... Well, all he was actually going to do was mutter under his breath about their ingratitude and lack of consideration, but it was going to be some very pointed muttering. Daisy returned with Miss Hughes in tow. Don't you two look smart, Miss Hughes said, her eyes lingering on Peter's empty sleeve. Thomas wondered if he ought to reassure her that, when sewing it down, he'd taken care to make sure the stitches would be easily ripped out again. But that probably wasn't what she was thinking about. Finally tearing her eyes away from Peter's left shoulder, she explained that Miss Patmore had planned a sort of buffet. With everything that's happening, it isn't likely they'll all be ready to dine at the same time. They'll want to sit through courses. She might have thought of that a bit earlier. A buffet hardly needed both of them, but now they were both ready, they might as well go through with it. As Thomas began thinking about which serving pieces would work for a buffet, Peter said, That seems very sensible. To Thomas he added, Now you don't have to worry about serving them from the wrong side. That, Thomas had to admit, was a bit of a relief. So what are we serving on this buffet? He asked. Fortunately, Miss Patmore wasn't planning a large number of dishes, so they'd be able to get by with just 3 wines, and they were able to figure out a plan using only pieces that were already polished. Anna helped with putting out the tablecloths, one on the table and one on the sideboard where the buffet would be arranged, and Peter decanted the wines, a job which required a steady hand, but only one. The buffet plan turned out to be a good one. At about the time they would normally have been changing for dinner, her ladyship took a turn for the worse, and Dr. Clarkson was summoned to the house again. Thomas didn't have the chance to hear much as it was happening, because he was busy in the kitchen reminding Miss Patmore that no one being ready for dinner at dinner time was precisely the eventuality they had anticipated, and that if she had prepared anything that couldn't be held over until they were ready to eat it, she had only herself to blame. The latter part, Thomas was given to understand, was not what Carson would have said, but it was precisely what he would have meant, so Thomas really didn't know why Miss Hughes was saying his name in that way people did when they thought he was being difficult. Thomas and Peter had been on duty in the otherwise empty dining room for about half an hour, keeping watch over the chafing dishes and periodically stirring things so that they wouldn't develop a crust, when the family finally started to trickle in. Lady Edith came in first, followed by Lady Mary and Mr. Matthew. They spoke quietly, but of ordinary things, from which Thomas gathered that her ladyship's condition was alarming, but she wasn't actively dying at the moment. His lordship came in quite a bit after the young ladies and Mr. Matthew, looking much more distracted. Thomas highly doubted that he particularly noticed or cared what he was putting onto his plate. He did, by the second time Peter filled his wine glass, pull himself together enough to notice that there was something unusual. "That's right," he said, in a steady, everything is normal sort of voice. "It's good of you to lend a hand." Thomas remembered hearing that voice come out of his own mouth in the days between the sinking of the Albion and the telegram. "So to speak," Lady Mary added dryly. Thomas glared at her, but he didn't think she noticed. She may, however, have noticed the reproving look that her father directed her way. Peter, of course, pretended not to notice any of it. He was much better at that than Thomas had ever been. Unfortunately, Thomas had warned him about the Crawleys' eccentric habit of speaking to servants in the dining room. "Not at all, my lord," he said smoothly. "It's quite nostalgic, really. It's been at least 10 years since Thomas and I have waited at table together." Lady Edith, perhaps trying to make up for her sister's rudeness, or to score points with her father by way of contrast, said, "Carson will be sorry he missed it. I don't remember when we last had 2 footmen in the dining room." Thomas did. Depending on how you looked at it, it had been either the night Lang had his breakdown in front of General Strutt, when Lang and William had, however, briefly been on duty at the same time, or the last time Thomas had waited at table before leaving for the army. He didn't say that, of course. Not that they wouldn't be here if Carson was. A footman only spoke when spoken to, and Thomas hadn't been. The only time he did speak was when his lordship finally decided he'd spent enough time pushing his food around on his plate and got up to leave. "My lord, are we expecting Lady Sybil to come down? Or shall I ask Miss Patmore to send up some sandwiches?" His lordship looked around vaguely as though he hadn't quite noticed his youngest daughter's absence. "Ah, sandwiches, I should think. She'll be staying with her ladyship until for some time. Thank you for thinking of it." "Yes, my lord." After clearing the buffet, Thomas's next unwelcome task was to take a supper tray up to Carson. He'd perked up enough to notice that Thomas was in livery. "You served the dinner?" he demanded. "It was more of a supper, really," Thomas answered, setting the tray on Carson's lap. "We weren't sure when or if they'd feel like eating, so Miss Patmore put together a buffet." Carson was already rumbling, but Thomas went on. "Mr. Fitzroy and I were able to handle it between us." "Mr. Fitzroy was in the dining room," Carson said flatly. "His lordship mentioned how good it was of him to pitch in," Thomas replied, brightly. "Now, do you have everything you need?" After waiting a suitable, if not particularly generous, amount of time for a response, Thomas left Carson to his own devices. The next morning they reported back to the house, in livery again, because why not? With some trepidation, but Thomas could see immediately from the looks on everyone's faces that her ladyship had not died in the night. "She's turned the corner, Lady Sybil says," Anna reported. "She'll be weak for some time yet, but she should be all right." The other surprise of the day was that Jane, the widowed maid, had handed in her notice. No one quite knew why. "I suppose it was difficult being away from her son so much," Anna speculated. "She might have found something that allows her to live out and see him every night." She also told Thomas that with her ladyship on the mend and Lady Mary's promise to cover for them, she and Bates were planning to keep their appointment at the registry office the next day. Thomas began running through the list of what they'd had for Daisy and William's even more hastily arranged wedding. Anna couldn't possibly expect him to help with her clothes and hair. Bates's maybe, but the man was a valet. If he couldn't dress himself for a registry office wedding, he was beyond helping. What else? I'm sure Lang will round up some flowers if you ask. Thomas didn't see how he'd have time to go looking for Lang today when he was covering for Carson again, but Bates ought to be able to do that too.
I'm sure he will,
Anna agreed. The ring was also plainly Bates's department, so that couldn't be what she wanted. Finally, the obvious occurred to him. How are you getting there?
The bus, I suppose.
Really? They were going to take the bus to their own wedding? That, Thomas figured, he could do something about. He didn't get his chance until he was taking the tea tray into the library and Lady Mary strolled in ahead of everyone else. My lady, he said with a nod. Yes, Anna mentioned you're aware of her errand in Ripon tomorrow. She said warily. I'm not sure it's any concern of yours. From the way she was acting, you'd have thought Thomas was the one who'd said something insulting the night before. For Anna's sake, he pressed on. I wondered about running them over there in the motor, if there's nothing else pressing at the time. It doesn't seem quite right for them to take the bus to their own wedding. She narrowed her eyes at him for a moment before saying, No, not quite right. Why? But before she could ask whatever it had been she was going to ask, his lordship came in. The moment had been lost, but she continued to direct searching looks his way until everyone had been given tea and Thomas was able to escape, at least until it was time to collect the tray again. Thomas will drive you and Bates into Ripon tomorrow, Mary announced as Anna was braiding her hair for bed.
That's kind,
Anna said, wondering why Thomas hadn't mentioned this, and since he hadn't, whether he knew he was doing it.
We don't mind taking the bus feeling, but I suppose it will make it a bit more special.
And they'd at least have a friend as one of the witnesses, too, if Mr. Fitzroy came along. He suggested it, Lady Mary said, meeting Anna's eyes in the mirror. I must admit, I'm surprised. Do you suppose he's up to something? Anna pretended to be dealing with a tangle in Lady Mary's hair as she considered how to answer that.
I don't think so, my lady. He and I are friends.
Are you? Lady Mary said dubiously. She did not actually ask since when, but Anna answered it anyway.
He's improved a great deal since the war.
Really? Lady Mary said. I thought Carson. She cut the thought off abruptly, perhaps having realized that she was perilously close to gossiping to a servant.
Mr. Carson doesn't approve of him and Mr. Fitzroy,
Anna explained. Lady Mary let out an unladylike snort. I'd have thought that would be a positive qualification in a chauffeur now.
I expect he hasn't thought of it quite that way,
Anna said thankfully. It was a nice ceremony, I suppose, Peter said as Thomas drove them back to Downton, Mr. and Mrs. Bates hand in hand in the back seat. I'd never seen a registry office wedding before. Thomas hadn't either. It was all right, he supposed, except for the part where they'd have to watch Bates kiss Anna. He could have gone his entire life without seeing that.
We're married, Anna said. That's the main thing. The marriage is more important than the wedding, my mother used to say.
Peter in agreement. I liked the bit with the ring. A symbol of all that we have promised and all that we share. A bit more romantic than I expected. Thomas immediately began thinking about where he could obtain a wedding ring. He didn't need one. He had the lighter, but Peter could have one if he wanted. Wearing it might be a different story, even if it was on his right hand, and it would have to be since Peter didn't have a left one. Someone was bound to notice. Something that didn't look like a wedding ring, perhaps? Though any kind of ring other than a wedding band on a man was hopelessly vulgar. A normal wedding band, then, and Peter could wear it on his watch chain. Thomas could buy it at a pawn shop. They wouldn't ask questions about why he wanted it, or why he wasn't buying a woman's ring to go with it.
Wait a bit to tell the others,
Anna was saying.
Once things have settled down, we'll announce it and talk to his lordship about our cottage.
What then were they planning to do about the wedding night? The men's corridor might be sparsely populated these days, but Carson was still there. Bates couldn't possibly smuggle Anna past him. We could leave the garage unlocked for you tonight. There was a moment of baffled silence from the back seat.
Thomas.
Bates said warningly. Peter interjected hastily. We had a reunion there when I first got back. It's a bit nicer than it sounds with the stove going and but perhaps our cottage would be a better choice, he suggested. Thomas and I can sleep in the dressing room and no! Thomas and Bates both shouted really, at the same moment. Thomas added an incredulous look in Peter's direction. Did he really think Thomas was going to let Bates have married relations in their bed?
That's very kind, Anna said tactfully, but I think we'll sort out that side of things all on our own.
That's probably best, Peter agreed. Back at the house, they were quickly swept up into the routine of things, as if nothing of note had happened at all during their jaunt to Ripon. It had been exactly the same way, of course, the night that Peter had given Thomas his cigarette lighter, but given that Anna and Bates's declarations had irrevocable legal significance, it seemed more than a little strange for the occasion to go entirely unremarked upon. That night, with her ladyship's life no longer in danger, there was a proper dinner, or at least the best approximation of one that they could manage. Thomas would just as soon have left it to Anna and Jane to serve it, but with Jane packing to leave and Anna in the first few hours of married life, there was no really good way to suggest it, even if Peter hadn't been enthusiastic about the prospect. And Peter was enthusiastic. Some experimentation proved that in addition to wine, he could do sauces, though we had to serve them from the wrong side, which was probably just as well since Thomas would be serving everything else from the right as well. Standing in the servery, facing down the first course, Thomas wished devoutly to be struck down by Spanish flu. A mild case, of course. When no conveniently timed symptoms appeared, Thomas took a deep breath, balanced the tray in his right hand, and went in. At least Carson wasn't there. And Peter was. Those were about the only two good things that could be said for the entirely ghastly experience. That and that the Dowager Countess wasn't present. There was no reasonable expectation that Carson would be back on his feet in the next 2 days, and she usually came to dine on a Sunday, so that reprieve was only temporary. There was a very good reason that footmen served from the diner's left, and that was so that the diners could use their right hands to help themselves from the dishes. From the right, they either had to use their left hands or reach awkwardly with their rights, with a rather high probability of tipping the serving spoon into their own laps. Lady Edith and Lady Sybil gamely experimented with helping themselves from the platter with their left hands and their rights, trying to find which was less awkward and reaching no particular conclusion. Lady Mary, watching this, sighed loudly and said, Could you come around to the other side? Thomas wished she would come down with Spanish flu, and it didn't have to be a mild case either, but obeyed, since he still had to hold the dish in his right hand. The only improvement this wrought was that the spoon dripped onto his sleeve instead of her dress. Back in the servery, he sponged it savagely. When the time came to serve the next course, he approached Lady Mary from the right, planted his feet, and stared fixedly at a spot over her head. She didn't argue with him about it, but when he repeated the performance with the pudding, she said to no one in particular, As there's no one truly able to serve the dinner, why don't we just help ourselves from the sideboard like we did yesterday? It was a thought Thomas had had more than once, but Lady Sybil said, Mary! In much the same way that people downstairs so often said, Thomas! I'm only saying, she said. She began, but fell silent when his lordship sent a quelling look her way. Thomas decided to take his victories where he could get them. Robert had, in fact, been wondering if there was a way he could suggest buffet suppers as a solution until the staff were back on their feet without insulting Barrow's professional pride. It had seemed unlikely to begin with, and it was certainly impossible now. After the girls went out, Barrow slunk out of the servery with the port and a frosty air of injured dignity. Robert wished he'd be a bit less dramatic, but he couldn't deny that Mary had been rude. Matthew had gone out with the girls, saying he'd play the bartender in the drawing room, so Robert said, "At times Lady Mary doesn't realize how things will sound before she says them. I believe that is a failing you're acquainted with." The temperature in the room dropped another few degrees. "My lord," Thomas said flatly. Robert had only meant to point out that Barrow had been with the household long enough for them to be acquainted with one another's foibles, but perhaps Mary's apple hadn't fallen far from the tree. He could tease Bates and even Carson, but Barrow wasn't much more inclined to take offense. On the whole, Robert was inclined to let him be insulted, if he was that determined to be, but he had promised God that if Cora was spared, he'd be a better and more honorable man. He'd been thinking particularly in terms of honoring his marriage vows, but being patient with Thomas Barrow seemed like the sort of sacrifice God would appreciate. He tried again. "I appreciate what you and Fitzroy are doing to keep us all going." "Yes, my lord," Barrow said flatly, as though he'd not even noticed he'd been complimented. "For the day after tomorrow, we could try coaching the whole boys through it. I can't say whether it'd be an improvement." It took Robert a moment to realize why he was looking ahead to the day after tomorrow, when, after all, they'd be dining again tomorrow as well. Yes, Mamma would handle the inconvenience with even less grace than Mary had. "The Dowager Countess isn't dining with us this week," he said, and watched Barrow almost sag with relief. "Dr. Clarkson says that everyone who was here the other night must have been exposed to the flu, but it doesn't seem a good idea to expose her again." Mamma could be challenging at times, but Robert would rather have her around to challenge him for a good while yet. "Very good, my lord," Barrow said. "I'll inform Miss Patmore." Then he stood there, holding the port, the other hand behind his back. He was obviously waiting for something, so Robert tried to guess what it was. "I'll remind Lady Mary that you and Fitzroy are doing your best under trying circumstances." That got him another chilly. "My lord." Robert gave up. He'd tried telling Carson that he appreciated Barrow's pitching in during the crisis. Perhaps that would do some good. They muddled through the next few days. His lordship must have meant it about speaking to Lady Mary, because she managed to get through the dinners without any pointed sighing. She also didn't try it on Peter, even when he, emboldened by his success with the sauces, essayed to take the side vegetable around on Sunday evening. So that made serving at table a little more tolerable, and experience did somewhat blur the edges of the indignity of doing everything all wrong, although he still cringed inwardly at the thought of Carson seeing or even hearing about the kind of performance they were putting in. Peter shrugged it off, saying things like, "Of course it's not quite correct, but there's no one else to do it," and "I expect it's good for their souls to be mildly inconvenienced once in a while." He was probably right about the latter, but inflicting mild inconvenience wasn't what being a footman was about. It was pretty much exactly the opposite. Reporting up to the house on Monday after breakfast, they were greeted with the news that Carson was back on duty. Thomas would have turned around and gone to the garage immediately, but Daisy was already bringing them cups of tea and plates of toast that Miss Patmore had been pressing on them the last few mornings. Whether because she agreed with Miss Hughes that men couldn't possibly manage to keep house competently, or she thought they'd be famished from the 5-minute walk from their cottage. Thomas didn't ask. Thomas glanced toward the butler's pantry, and Miss Hughes said, "He's in the breakfast room already. Dr. Clarkson said he was to take it easy, but that'll be the day." Peter opened his mouth, and Thomas kicked his ankle under the table before he could offer their continued assistance. Peter kicked him back and said, "Thomas has plenty to do in the garage, but I'll help if I can."
"I'm sure that would be appreciated,"
Miss Hughes said, with only a fraction of a moment's hesitation.
"We're so short-handed. Gertie's back on her feet as well, but Sally and Milly are still flat on their backs, and I think Harold's coming down with it."
They talked a bit about the tasks for the day. Peter and Miss Hughes talked, that is, while Thomas drank tea and ate toast. At one point, Miss Hughes said tactfully,
"Mr. Carson is particularly eager to get back in the dining room, of course."
"As well he should be," O'Brien chimed in. "If there's anything more ridiculous than a one-armed man playing the footman, I can't imagine what it could be." Silence rang out. Peter very carefully set down his teacup. After briefly considering whether punching O'Brien was worth going to prison for and concluding it was not, Thomas suggested, "Up to old Shrew playing the devoted angel of mercy." No one said, "Thomas!" and Peter even nudged Thomas's foot with his. O'Brien made no reply, and Thomas caught her watching the bellboard out of the corner of her eye, hoping her ladyship would ring and let her make a dignified exit. She still hadn't by the time Carson came back down. Thomas stood up. Everyone else did too, but Thomas was planning what the army had called an advance to the rear.
"Mr. Barrow,"
Carson said. A long pause gave Thomas plenty of time to brace himself for something even worse than being reminded he wasn't welcome in the servants' hall.
"I must give you my thanks for the way you've kept it all going during my indisposition."
It had to be a setup, but for what? Thomas considered telling him he hadn't done it for him, but that might make whatever Carson was about to do look justified. He didn't want to say, "You're welcome," though, because Carson decidedly wasn't. Just when this hesitation became noticeable, Thomas suddenly thought of the perfect answer.
"It was Mr. Fitzroy's idea."
Carson went stiff. Stiffer than usual. But he actually said almost pleasantly,
"Thank you, Mr. Fitzroy."
Miss Hughes spoke up. "Mr. Fitzroy has offered to help us again today, which I'm sure we'll be very grateful for," she said meaningfully. "Mr. Barrow has duties of his own to get back to, if we can manage without him." Carson gave him a very skeptical look, and Thomas said, "The motors are due for their weekly maintenance." Overdue, in fact, but Thomas wouldn't admit to being behind on his work in front of Carson, even if it was because he'd been doing Carson's job for him.
"Of course,"
Carson said. He looked over at Miss Hughes, who nodded encouragingly.
"Perhaps when you've finished with that, you'll join us for dinner."
Now that had to be a setup for something. Before Thomas could begin to figure out what, though, Miss Hughes cleared her throat.
"And
Carson said, "And?"
your brother, of course."
What the actual fuck? "We've enjoyed having you around again," Miss Hughes added. Now Thomas put it together. Carson had been moved, somehow, to rescind their banishment from the servants' hall, and the way he'd managed to do it was to pretend he believed the line about them being brothers. In fact, after spending nearly all their waking hours up at the house for the last few days, Thomas would have rather had a quiet dinner at home with Peter, but he knew better than to spurn an olive branch. "I think we're free," he said, turning to Peter. Peter nodded. "We'd be delighted." "There," Miss Hughes said when she and Mr. Carson had retreated to his pantry. "Was that so difficult?" Mr. Carson's only response to that was an arch look.
"I suppose if it was Mr. Fitzroy's idea that they should lend their efforts in the crisis, there are worse influences for Thomas to come under,"
he allowed. That she thought was true, though perhaps not in the way Mr. Carson intended it. "Thomas does seem happier," she said, instead of arguing the point. "I expect it suits him, having a bit of distance from the rest of us." Certain of them, at any rate. "But you think Mr. Fitzroy likes a bit of society now and then?"
"Hm!"
Mr. Carson shook his head.
"They'd best not make a spectacle of themselves," he warned, "and that's all I'll say on that subject."
"That," Miss Hughes responded in kind, "sounds like a very good idea."
"You be on your best behavior tonight,"
Peter warned him as they walked up to the house that evening. "Carson admitted me," Thomas said grimly. He'd had plenty of time over the course of the day to reconsider his interpretation of Carson's invitation. It could still be a trap of some sort. "Even if he isn't, you're going to be the bigger man," Peter informed him. "Like, that'll be difficult," Thomas noted. "Get it out of your system." That one Thomas was happy to go along with. "I wonder if it actually hurt him to say, 'and your brother,' or maybe it gave him palpitations." "Maybe," said Peter agreeably. "I'd give a lot to know who twisted his arm," Thomas added. "Miss Hughes is my best guess, but what do you suppose she has on him?" "He's in love with her," Peter said. Thomas tripped over nothing. "He is not!"
Carson is incapable of love. Peter ignored that. I'm not sure if he realizes it yet. She certainly doesn't. Don't be disgusting, Thomas said. Well, we were about to eat. I think it's nice, Peter objected. I mean, they're ancient, but it just goes to show it's never too late. But Carson is horrible, Thomas reminded him. Maybe being in love will soften him, Peter suggested. It's been known to happen. Ugh, Thomas changed the subject. Havana and Bates told the others yet? They hadn't as of that morning, but Peter had been up at the house most of the day. No, Peter answered. We should invite them to dinner, he added, at the cottage. You mean Anna and Bates, right? The Bates part of that was bad enough, but the alternative was Carson and Miss Hughes. Peter nodded. Yes, I suppose. Carson was, as it turned out, on his best behavior that evening. The conversation started off on the thoroughly uncontroversial theme of how splendid it was that her ladyship was recovering. The only dangerous moment came when Gertie, fresh from her own sickbed, said, Now that her ladyship is better, have they set a date for the wedding? Everyone suddenly found interesting things to look at in the corners or near the ceiling as Carson huffed like a steam engine. At some length, Miss Hughes rescued the moment by saying, I don't believe Lady Mary and Mr. Matthew have thought much about the wedding while she was so ill. Gertie, fortunately, caught on, and both she and Carson pretended that theirs was the wedding she had been speaking of all along. After that, the talk moved to the subject of Spanish flu more generally. The village had only a few dozen cases so far, light compared to some places. This, too, everyone readily agreed was good. When the meal was over, Peter pulled Anna and Bates aside and invited them to the cottage the next night. We usually eat a bit earlier than they do in the service hall, he explained. You can come over after you finish dressing them for dinner, and you'll be back well before they go up. Thomas hadn't quite realized that Peter meant to invite them immediately, but when Anna said, That would be lovely, he couldn't really object. Not in front of her, anyway. He saved it for when they were walking back to the cottage. Do we have to have them tomorrow? We've barely had any time to ourselves lately. I thought they could use a night off from having to pretend they're not a couple, Peter explained. We know what that's like. True enough. They'll eventually get to stop, Thomas pointed out. Peter gave him a look. We don't have to pretend either while we're entertaining them. Huh. No, they wouldn't have to, would they? If Bates did anything disgusting, like kissing Anna again, he could see how they'd like watching them at it. The next morning, however, brought a sudden change in their plans. Thomas was leaning against the garage door frame, smoking a cigarette and keeping an eye out for Peter, who usually brought him a cup of tea at about this time when an unfamiliar black car coming up the drive. If it belonged to guests of the family, it would be his job to tell their chauffeur where to park it, or, if they'd driven themselves, as was increasingly common, to park it himself. Thomas straightened up and watched as it took the turning that led to the kitchen courtyard. Definitely not where visiting chauffeurs were supposed to park. Delivery drivers did, but the car didn't look like any tradesman's van that Thomas had ever seen. He started over, trying to quickly finish his cigarette as he went. If it was anything other than a confused visiting chauffeur, he'd best not greet them with a cigarette in hand. He caught up to the motor car as two men in not very good suits were getting out of it. Bloody buckering fuck! For a man like Thomas, being able to spot a roser at 20 paces was a vital survival skill. His first thought, of course, was that they were there for him and Peter, and he automatically moved into the cover of the courtyard wall, calculating escape routes. He'd got as far as realizing there was no way to warn Peter in time when it suddenly occurred to him that they might not be, probably weren't in fact, after them at all. He took up a position where he had a good view of the kitchen door, but wouldn't be easily seen. The taller of the two men knocked, and a moment or two later a hall boy answered the door. The policemen held up their warrant cards and spoke for a moment. The hall boy spoke back, then closed the door. Carson appeared a moment later. The policemen again displayed their identification and spoke to Carson at greater length than they had to the hall boy. At one point Carson appeared to protest, as he would hardly have been likely to do if they had been here for Thomas and Peter.
Still, when Carson at last admitted them into the house, instead of pointing an accusing finger in the direction of the garage and chauffeur's cottage, Thomas let out a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding. Not then. Bates. Anna. Thomas hesitated. Peter would be a lot better for this sort of thing, but even though he was almost nearly completely sure, Thomas wouldn't bring Peter right into the reach of police. Squaring his shoulders and wishing he had time for another cigarette, he headed to the house. He got there just in time to see Bates being marched down the passage from the servants' hall. It seemed the entire staff was there, lining the walls and lingering in doorways, watching it happen. Thomas thought of marching his work detail past Rouse tied to a post, and kept his eyes front. Once Bates and the two policemen had passed him, he saw Anna standing framed by the servants' hall doorway, with a light behind her. He thought of a messenger boy standing in the kitchen doorway, with a light behind him, bringing a telegram that would shatter the world to pieces. He thought of Anna saying, "I don't mean to rub it in, that we're going to be happy and Mr. Fitzroy will always be dead." There was no pleasure in the reversal of fortune, or at least not in the second half of it. A blink, and Thomas found himself at Anna's side, watching her lower lip tremble. They were the only ones in the servants' hall, everyone else having had the sense to hang back. Why hadn't he? There wasn't any scheme, no bit of blackmail or bribery or cleverness that would make this any better. They couldn't run for the car and take off in hot pursuit of Bates' abductors. Well, they could, but it wouldn't accomplish anything except maybe getting both of them sacked. They couldn't go to the police and present some well-constructed story that would explain away everything. They couldn't find the policeman's weak spot and exploit it because they had the whole legal system behind them. Even if the two men they had just seen could be gotten out of the way, someone else would step into their shoes. There was just nothing. Slowly, Thomas reached out and squeezed Anna's arm. Now he understood why she was always doing that, what it meant. "There's nothing I can do to help," it meant. And also, but if there were, I'd do it.